My son, put a for sale. Sign in my yard. While I was napping, then the buyer knocked. I fell asleep in my chair after lunch, the way I do most afternoons now, with the ball game low on the radio and the sun coming warm through the front window. And I woke to a knock at the door, and when I opened it, there stood a young couple on my porch. Nice-looking kids, late 20s maybe, the young man in a good shirt and the young woman with a folder under her arm. And they smiled at me, a little uncertain, and the young woman said, "Hi, sorry to bother you. We're a few minutes early for the showing. We're here to see the house. The one that's for sale?" For sale. I stood there in the doorway of the house I've lived in for 51 years. The house I carried my wife across the threshold of. The house all 4 of my children were born in and my Marie died in. And I looked past those 2 kind young faces to the front yard where I've watered the same grass for half a century. And there, planted in my lawn, right next to Marie's rose bushes, was a sign. A real estate sign. For sale, it said, in big red letters, with a smiling woman's photograph and a phone number, and a little rider box hanging off the bottom that said, "Open, showings by appointment." I hadn't sold anything. I hadn't listed anything. I hadn't so much as spoken to a real estate agent in 51 years since the day Marie and I signed for this place with a baby on the way and $40 in the bank. And yet there was a sign in my yard and a nice young couple on my porch with a folder, here to walk through my rooms and imagine their own life in them. And I understood, standing there in my socks with the ball game still murmuring behind me, exactly what had happened, because there was only one person in the world who could have done it. My son, Kevin. He had put my house up for sale while I slept in my chair. Now I'm going to ask you to stay with me, because I know how this sounds, and I promise you it goes a great deal deeper and a great deal worse than one sign in one yard. But first I want to tell you what I did, standing in that doorway, because it's the thing this whole story turns on. I did not shout. I did not grab that folder out of the young woman's hands. I did not march out into the yard and tear that sign out of Marie's roses, though Lord knows I wanted to. I looked at those 2 hopeful kids, and I saw right away they didn't know a thing. They were just young people looking for a home, and none of this was their doing. So I said, gentle as I could, "I'm sorry, folks. There's been a mistake. This house isn't for sale. I think somebody's given you the wrong address." And I watched the confusion cross their faces, and the young man looked at his phone and said, This is the address our agent sent us." And I said, "I understand. But I live here, son. And I have for 51 years, and I can promise you I'm not selling. You go on now. I'm sorry you came all this way." And they apologized, embarrassed, and went back down my walk to their car and drove off to whatever their next appointment was. And I stood in the doorway and watched them go. And then I looked at that sign in my yard a long, long time. 60 years I was a barber. 60 years I stood behind a chair with a pair of scissors and a straight razor. And I'll tell you what, 60 years of that teaches a man. It teaches you to read people. You spend your whole life a foot away from a man's face, watching him in the mirror while you work, and a face can't hide from a barber the way it hides from the rest of the world. I've watched men come in trying to look happy over a marriage that was ending. I've watched boys try to look tough before they shipped out. I've watched 1,000 men not quite say the thing that was eating them, and I learned to hear it anyway in what they didn't say. So, when I stood there looking at that sign, I wasn't confused the way my son was counting on me to be. I was reading, and what I read, plain as if it were printed on that sign, was this. My son thought I was finished. He thought I was a doddering old man who dozed through the sale of his own house and never be the wiser. He thought I was so far gone that he could stand a sign in my yard and march strangers through my living room while I slept, and I'd never put it together. And here's the thing my son forgot. The thing this whole story comes down to. The thing worth more than a sign or a folder or a smiling agent's photograph. To sell a house, you have to own it. And on the one piece of paper that actually decides who owns a house in this country, the deed, the title, the paper with the name on it, that house was mine. Sam Reardon. In my name, in a trust that only I controlled, exactly the way my wife Marie set it up before she died. God rest her, because she was smarter than the both of us, and she saw something coming that I was too trusting to see. My son could put 100 signs in my yard. He could list my house on every website there is, and march a parade of young couples through my front door. But he could not sell what he did not own, and he did not own one nail of that house, and he never would, because Marie made sure the name on the paper was mine and kept it somewhere my son could never reach it. He forgot to check whose name was on the title, and 2 weeks after that young couple knocked on my door, that one thing he forgot was going to bring the whole thing down on his head. The sign and the forged papers behind it, and the plan behind those, which went so far past one house that it took my breath when I finally saw the whole of it. Because the sign wasn't really about the house, any more than it was about that one afternoon nap. The sign was my son telling me, plain as a barber reads a face, exactly how he saw me. As a problem that slept through the afternoon, an obstacle to be handled while I dozed. A used-up old man whose house and whose money and whose whole remaining life were, in his mind, already his to sell. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about all of it. And he was about to find out, the way a man finds out he's misjudged the fellow in the barber's chair, that the quiet old man he'd written off had been watching him in the mirror the whole time. Before I tell you what I found when I stopped napping and started looking, and it went all the way to a scheme to have me declared out of my mind and sell this house out from under me while I sat in a facility across town, let me ask you one small thing. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight and how old you are, because I've got a feeling some of you know exactly what it is to wake up one day and find that somebody's decided your life is theirs to hand off. If you've ever been treated like a thing that's just in the way, an old man asleep in a chair, a sign to be planted while you dozed, then do an old barber a kindness and hit that like button, and subscribe, and stay with me to the end. Because this is the story of the day my son put a "for sale" sign in my yard while I was napping and marched a buyer up to my door. And it's the story of what that old man's name on a piece of paper turned out to be worth. Stay till the end. The end is where he found out. Let me tell you what kind of story this is, so you know what you're settling in for. There's no shouting in it. In 60 years behind a barber's chair, I learned that the man who raises his voice has already lost the room. And I never once raised mine at my son, not through any of it, not even at the end when the truth was on the table and everyone could see it. A barber can't do his work in a temper. You've got a blade in your hand and a man's throat under it, and the whole job, the whole trade, is steadiness, calm hands, a quiet voice, patience with a thing that can't be rushed. I worked 60 years that way, and when the trouble came, I worked it the same way. I didn't fight my son. I did the slow, patient, careful thing, the thing a man like Kevin can't do and can't stand, because a man like Kevin has to have everything right now, and a man like me has spent his whole life learning how to wait for the right moment and not a second before. And I want to say one more thing before we go back, so nobody comes to this looking for the wrong thing. This isn't a story about revenge. I know the title sounds like one, but I wasn't ever after getting even. I was after keeping my home and getting my daughter back and making sure a good grandchild came through it whole and laying the truth out where nobody could ever again call it a confused old man's imagination. Revenge is a young man's idea. What I wanted was to repair what could be repaired and protect what could be protected, and let the truth do the rest, because the truth, like a bad haircut growing out, has a way of coming right in the end if you just don't panic and let it. So, when you hear how this closes, don't hear it as an old man getting even with his boy. Hear it as an old man saving his home, and holding on to the people worth holding on to, and letting his son reap exactly what his son had planted, no more and no less. But to understand how I came to be an old man asleep in a chair while his son sold his house, you have to understand what took the fight out of me first. You have to understand about Marie. The house was too quiet without her. 51 years Marie filled these rooms with sound. Her voice, her radio, the clatter of her in the kitchen, her humming, the endless friendly argument of a long marriage. And when she was gone, the quiet came down over this house like a sheet over the furniture in a room nobody uses anymore. We got the diagnosis on a Tuesday in a specialist's office downtown, and I remember I kept staring at his diplomas on the wall so I wouldn't have to watch Marie's face take it in. And the cancer took her over about a year, a piece at a time, and it was not gentle, and when it was done, 51 years of marriage was done with it, and I was 72 years old and alone in a house full of a person who wasn't there anymore. You don't know what to do with yourself after. I'd reach for her in the bed before I was awake and find it cold and lose her all over again. First thing, every morning, fresh. I set 2 cups out for coffee for months before my hands learned better. Her reading glasses are still on the little table by her side of the bed. I've never moved them, and I started, in that first year, to do the thing my son would later use against me. I started to fade, to go quiet, to sleep in my chair in the afternoons because the days were long and empty and sleep was the only place Marie still was. My family watched me fade, and one of them, at least, did the arithmetic. He looked at his grieving father, dozing in a chair in the afternoon, and where a decent man would have seen a heart that was broken, my son saw an opportunity. He saw a man too far gone to notice a sign in his own yard. And here's what he never understood. Because he'd never in his life loved anybody the way I loved his mother. Grief that deep doesn't make a man simple. Sometimes it's the thing that finally sharpens him. Because a man who's already lost the one person he couldn't live without has nothing left to be afraid of. Kevin thought he was dealing with a soft, frightened old man he could frighten a little more. He was dealing with a man who had already survived the worst day of his life in a specialist's office on a Tuesday, and who therefore could not be threatened with anything at all. That's the thing about the bottom, son. Once you've been to it, you're not scared of the fall anymore. My son looked at me asleep in that chair and thought he'd found the easiest mark in the world. He'd found the one man in that county with nothing left to lose. I'll give you one night so you understand the man they thought they were dealing with. It was maybe 3 months after the funeral, and I woke around 2 in the morning the way I did every night then, reaching across the bed for Marie before I was even awake, and finding it cold. And losing her again, fresh the way you do. And I couldn't get back to sleep, so I got up and walked through the dark house in my socks, room to room, the way you pace when there's nowhere to go and nothing to do with the ache. And I ended up in the front room, in the dark, standing among Marie's things, her chair, her books, the little table with her reading glasses still on it. And I understood, all at once, that there was nobody left in the world who needed me to come to bed. 51 years, somebody had always wanted me to come to bed. And I stood there in the dark in the middle of the house we'd made, an old man with no one to come home to inside his own home. And I said out loud, to the dark and to her chair, I don't know how to be here without you, Marie. I don't know how to do this. That was the man my son looked at and saw an opportunity. A widower talking to an empty chair at 2 in the morning. And I understand, in a cold way, why he thought it would work. A man that broken looks finished. What Kevin never understood, because he'd never loved anybody the way I loved his mother, is that a man who's already lost the one thing he couldn't bear to lose has run clean out of fear. You cannot frighten a man past the worst thing, once the worst thing has already happened to him in a doctor's office on a Tuesday. My son looked at me asleep in that chair and thought he'd found the easiest mark in the world. He'd found the one man in that county with nothing left to lose. Let me tell you about the house, and about the shop, and about Marie, because you can't understand what my son tried to take unless you understand what it was. And it was never just a house. Marie and I bought this place 51 years ago, a young barber and his bride with a baby, coming, and next to nothing in the bank. It was the only house we ever owned, and we owned it hard, the way you own the thing you nearly couldn't afford. We papered these walls ourselves, on weekends, arguing happily about the color. I built the shelves in the front room with my own hands. Marie planted those rose bushes out front, our second spring here, little bare sticks that everybody said wouldn't take, and they took. And now they're taller than she was, and they come back every June, whether anybody deserves them or not. All 4 of my kids took their first steps across this living room floor. My oldest got married in the backyard under a tent that leaked. And my Marie, when the time came and she asked to come home from the hospital, died in the front bedroom of this house with the window open and me holding her hand and 51 years of our life all around her in every room. This house isn't lumber and plaster to me. This house is the body my whole life lived in. My son looked at it and saw a listing price. And I want you to hold on to that difference because it's the root of everything. There is what a thing is worth and there is what a thing costs. And they are not the same thing. And it takes a certain kind of empty man to look at the second and be blind to the first. To Kevin, this house was a number, square footage, a hot market, a comp sheet, a check. To me, it was Marie's roses and the pencil marks on the kitchen door frame where I measured 4 children growing up. Kevin could tell you to the dollar what this house would fetch. He could not have told you one single thing about what it was worth because he never learned the difference. And not learning that difference is the whole story of my son. Let me give you just one memory of this house, so you understand it isn't sentiment, it's a life. Marie's last good week, near the end, when she was too weak for much, she asked me to walk her through the house one more time. Not the hospital, not anywhere, just the house. And I did. I walked my dying wife slow from room to room, both of us holding on, and in each room she stopped and put her hand on things. The kitchen door frame with the pencil marks where we measured 4 kids. The spot in the front room where our oldest took her first step. The window over the sink where she'd watched 51 years of seasons come and go over her roses. She didn't say much. She just touched it all, taking her leave of it room by room. And at the front bedroom, she stopped and looked out at the roses and said, "It was a good house, Sam. We made it a good house." And a few weeks later, she died in that room, with the window open and me holding her hand. So no, this house is not lumber and a lot line. This house is every room my whole life happened in, and the last place my hand ever held Marie's. My son looked at it and saw what a stranger would pay to tear it down. He had no idea what he was reaching for when he planted that sign in the roses. He never did. Kevin could tell you to the dollar what this house would fetch. He could not have told you one single thing about what it was worth, because he never learned the difference, and not learning the difference is the whole story of my son. I made my living down at the shop, Reardon's, 3 chairs, on the corner of a street that used to be the heart of this neighborhood, before the neighborhood changed. 60 years I stood behind the first chair. I cut the hair of 3 generations of this town, cut a boy's first haircut, then cut that boy's hair for his wedding, then cut his son's first haircut, the whole circle, over and over, 60 years of it. A barbershop isn't just a place you get your hair cut. For a lot of men, it's the one place they can go and be known and be listened to, and put their guard down for 20 minutes. Men told me things in that chair they never told their wives. I learned to keep my mouth shut and my hands moving and just listen, because half of what a barber really does has nothing to do with hair. And in 60 years of that, a foot from 10,000 faces, watching men in the mirror while I worked, I got so I could read a person the way you read the weather, the true thing under the thing they were showing you. Hold on to that, because it's how I knew, long before I could prove it, that something was wrong with my son. Marie kept the books, for the shop and for the house both. She had the head for it, and God knows I didn't. I was a barber, not a bookkeeper. Marie handled every dollar, every bill, every bit of paper for 51 years, and she did it at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a pair of reading glasses that are still sitting by our bed. And it was Marie, being Marie, who years ago did the one thing that ended up saving everything I had. But I'll come to that, because it deserves its own telling, and because it's the whole reason my son's plan was doomed from the first sign he ever planted in my yard. By the time Marie got sick, the 2 of us had something we'd never once have called rich. A paid-off house, a little put-by, the shop. But the neighborhood had changed around us over the decades. The corner where Reardon sat, and the street where our house sat, had gone from a working man's neighborhood to something the young people call up-and-coming, which means the houses that folks like Marie and me bought for a song are worth a fortune now to somebody who wants to knock them down or flip them. Our little paid-off house sat on a lot worth more money than I made in 20 years of cutting hair. And that, it turned out, was the poison that got into my son. Because Kevin looked at his parents' modest little house and did not see the place he took his first steps. He saw a number that had gotten very big, and a father who was, in his estimation, no longer using it hard enough to deserve it. But before I show you what he tried to do, you have to meet my children. Marie and I raised 4 children in this house. 2 of them live far off now. One out west, one down south. Good people, busy with their own lives, and they're not really part of this story, except that they believed for a while the same lies everybody else was told, because they were too far away to see. This story really comes down to 2 of my children. One of them is the reason there was a for sale sign in Marie's roses. The other is the reason I'm able to tell you how it turned out. The one who put up the sign is Kevin, my son. And I'll be as fair to him as a father can be, because I helped make him, and I won't pretend otherwise. Kevin was always looking for the shortcut. Even as a boy, he wanted the prize without the work, the money without the trade. His brother and sisters would take a summer job. Kevin had a scheme. And as a man, he never changed. He chased one quick fortune after another, one deal, one investment, one sure thing that was going to make him rich all at once. And every one of them came apart, and he never learned the lesson because the lesson was patience and Kevin could not stand still long enough to learn it. By the time his mother got sick, Kevin was in a bad way, worse than any of us knew. Debts he was hiding, a business circling the drain, the whole handsome front of his life held up with nothing behind it. And he looked at his father's paid-off house, sitting on a lot the developers were drooling over, and he could not leave it alone. That house could make every problem Kevin had disappear. There was just one thing in the way: me. There was a moment, years before any of this, that I should have read for what it was, and didn't, because I still loved the boy I remembered. Kevin was grown by then, doing well or seeming to, and he came by one Sunday in a car that cost more than I cleared in 2 years of cutting hair. And he stood in the front room, looking around at the place he grew up in, and he shook his head and said, "You know what you two are sitting on here, right? This lot's worth a fortune now. You could sell this place, buy some little condo, and put the rest in your pocket. Why are you still hanging on to this old house? This old house." I looked at him a while, and I said, "Mild? And where would your mother's roses go, in a condo?" And he laughed like I'd made a joke, and said something about how they've got landscapers for that, and went to see if Marie had any coffee on. And Marie watched the whole thing from the kitchen doorway, and that night she said a thing I turn over all the time now. She said, "You hear your son, Sam? He looked at the house he took his first steps in, and all he could see was what a stranger would pay to tear it down. He can't see the home. He's never once been able to see the home, only the price. And a man who looks at everything you love and sees only what it'll fetch, one day that man is going to look at you and find your price too. Watch him." Marie saw it before I did. She always saw the people before I did. I told her she was being hard on the boy. She wasn't. She was just 3 years early. Kevin's wife is Renee, and I'll not be cruel about her, but I'll be honest. Renee liked the life the money was supposed to buy, and she was not particular about where the money came from. And when Kevin started reaching for his father's house, Renee was not behind him saying, "Stop." She was the one who first started saying, at family dinners, in that gentle, worried voice, that maybe this house was getting to be too much for me, that maybe I'd be happier somewhere I didn't have to keep everything up, that she worried about me here alone. She planted it soft and watered it every visit. Kevin was the one drowning. Renee was the one who kept whispering that the lifeboat was just sitting there in his father's front yard. And then there's Erin, my daughter. And here I have to own my own part, because the distance between Erin and me was at least half my doing, and it's the very gap my son crawled through. Erin and I are too much alike, both stubborn, both proud, both quick to go quiet instead of quick to make up. We'd had a falling out years back, the ordinary stupid kind that families have, the kind that would have mended itself in a month if two proud people hadn't each been waiting for the other to call first. And then Marie, who'd always been the bridge between Erin and me, got sick and died, and the bridge went with her, and Erin and I were left on opposite banks with nobody to carry a message across. And that was exactly the opening Kevin and Renee needed, and they worked it like a wound. They told Erin I was bitter, that I blamed her, that I got agitated when she came around, that it was really kinder to stay away and let them handle things. And they told me a matching set about Erin, that she was too busy, that she'd said she wanted nothing to do with the mess, that she'd washed her hands of her old father. 2 poison stories, one for each of us, to keep the one child who'd have seen through everything as far from me as they could get her. Because Erin, of all my kids, works in the one field that made her dangerous to them. My Erin works at a title company. She spends her days with deeds and escrow and closings and powers of attorney. If Erin had been in the room, she'd have smelled what Kevin was doing in about 30 seconds. That's exactly why they made so sure she never got in the room. And then there's Katie, Kevin and Renee's daughter, my granddaughter, 17 years old, and the bright thread running through this whole dark cloth. Katie started coming down to the shop when she was little, and never stopped. She'd sweep up the hair and hand me my combs, and by the time she was 15, she was asking me to teach her to cut, and she had the hands for it, and the patience, and the thing you can't teach, which is that she actually liked people, liked listening to them, the way a real barber has to. Katie loved me, and she was ashamed of her father in the quiet, watchful way of a good kid who can see more than the grown-ups think, and everything I did when the time came, I did with one eye always on that girl, making sure that whatever fell on Kevin never once fell on Katie. Remember her. Because in the end, The house and the money were not the most important thing I had to protect. Katie was. And now I have to tell you the one thing from before all this that turned out to matter more than everything else put together. And it was Marie's doing at that same kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold. Years back, long before she got sick, Marie sat me down and made me do something that felt at the time like a lot of fuss over nothing. A woman from her church had lost her home, signed it over to a son to keep it simple. The son hit hard times, and the house got taken by the son's creditors, and the old woman ended up with nothing in a rented room at 80. And it put the fear of God into Marie, and she came home and laid down the law at that kitchen table, tapping it with her finger the way she did when she meant business. "Sam," she said, "the house stays in your name, yours and mine and then just yours, in a trust that only we control, not in the kids' names, not to make it easy, not signed over to anybody for any sweet-sounding reason ever. And the real papers, the deed, the trust, the important things, they don't live in a drawer in this house where anybody could get at them. They go in a box at the bank, and only we hold the key. You be as good to those children as your heart tells you, Sam. Help them, give to them, love them till it hurts. But your name stays on this house, and the papers stay where only you can reach them, because the day you sign your home away is the day you find out what somebody really thinks of you, and by then, you're standing on the sidewalk." And then, she said the thing I hear now in my sleep. She took my hand across the table, and she said, "A house is just wooden nails, Sam. I'm the one who made it a home, and one day I won't be here too. So you keep your name on the papers, and you keep the home safe for whoever still deserves it. Promise me." I thought she was worrying over nothing. I promised her to put her mind at ease. And Marie, 3 years in the ground, saved my home with that conversation. Because when my son put a sign in my yard, he did it dead certain the house was already as good as his. He never knew that his mother had built a wall around it before she left, and the only door in that wall opened with a key that lived in my pocket and a name that lived on a deed in a box at the bank where a sign in the yard couldn't reach and a forged signature couldn't reach, and my son couldn't reach. I remember everything about that kitchen table talk now, with the sharpness you only get looking back at the thing that turned out to be your salvation. Marie's cup of tea, her reading glasses pushed up on her head, the way she took my hand off the table and held it in both of hers when she wanted my whole attention, and not the half of it that was thinking about the shop. "Sam," she said, "you are the kindest man I ever met, and you'd give the shirt off your back to any one of these kids, and one day that kindness is going to be the thing somebody uses against you if you don't hear me now." And she didn't just make me promise with words. Marie never trusted words. She trusted the doing of a thing. She made me get in the car that same Saturday and drive with her down to the bank, and with her own hands, not mine, she put the deed and the trust papers in a safe deposit box, and she closed it, and she pressed the little key into my palm and folded my fingers over it and said, "This comes to you and to nobody else. Not Kevin, not Renee, not some helpful person one of them brings around one day. When somebody starts asking you real sweet where you keep your important papers, Sam, you remember this drive, and you smile, and you keep your mouth shut." I laughed and told her she was talking like we were hiding the crown jewels. She didn't laugh. She looked at me the way she looked at me when she was dead serious, and she said, "Sam, the ones who come to take your home never come looking like robbers. They come looking like family. That's the only way it ever works." I thought she was worrying over nothing. I did it to put her mind at ease. And Marie, 3 years in the ground, saved the house I'm sitting in right now with that drive to the bank, because when my son planted his sign in her roses, he did it dead certain the house was already as good as his, and the one thing standing between him and it was a small brass key in an old barber's pocket, and a name on a deed in a box he could never open. After Marie died, Kevin and Renee came around more than they had in years, and at the time, grieving and grateful for any company in that silent house, I welcomed it. I was a lonely old man rattling around 51 years of memories, and suddenly here was my son dropping by. My daughter-in-law bringing a dish, somebody to sit with of an evening, and I let it in the way a cold man leans toward a fire, and I never once stopped to ask why the fire had come around now, after all this time. It started so gently, you couldn't have called it anything but love, concern. "Dad, this is a big house for one person. Dad, you shouldn't be up on a ladder cleaning gutters at your age. Dad, what if you fell, all alone out here? Who'd know? Renee worked the word alone like a barber strops a razor, a little sharper every visit. She'd tell me, so tenderly, about some old fellow who'd had a fall and lain on his kitchen floor for 2 days before anybody found him, about how it just wasn't safe, wasn't sensible for a man my age to be keeping up a whole house by himself. She was building a picture, week by week, of an old man alone in a house that was too much for him. A picture where the only loving thing, the only responsible thing, was for that old man to be somewhere easier, somewhere safe. She was laying track toward a station I couldn't see yet. And Kevin was laying track of his own from the money side, because Kevin started helping. That's the word he used. He came to me a few months after the funeral, all concerned, and said I shouldn't have to worry about the bills and the bank and all the paperwork anymore. Not at my age, not with my grief. That Mom had always handled that, and now that she was gone, why didn't he step in and take it off my plate? And I was tired and lost without Marie. And the paperwork she'd always done was a cold mountain I had no heart to climb. So I let him. I let my son start helping with the money. I signed a thing or two he put in front of me. I didn't read them close, God forgive me. I was grieving and he was my son. And I gave him a look into the accounts, and slowly, without my quite seeing it, I stopped being the man who ran his own life and became an old man who was gently, lovingly steered away from his own affairs, his own mail, his own money, by the two people who'd decided to take it all. And then came the sign. And the sign, like I told you, was the moment it all turned, because the sign was Kevin getting greedy and careless at the same time. Up until the sign, he'd been patient, gentle, all soft concern. But the sign was him deciding he didn't need to be patient anymore. The sign was him looking at his father, asleep in a chair, and deciding he could just do it. Just list the house, just march buyers through, and the old man would sleep through it and sign whatever got put in front of him at the end. And if that had been all of it, one reckless sign, one bad idea, I might even have found a way to forgive it, grief and blood and all. But it wasn't all of it, because to put that sign in my yard, to list my house, my son had needed something he didn't have and couldn't get honestly, the legal authority to sell a house that wasn't his. And rather than come to me and ask, because I might have said no, he had manufactured it, he had forged it. And when I pulled that one thread, the question of how exactly my son had been able to list a house he didn't own, the whole ugly garment started to come apart in my hands. I want to tell you how I first knew, deep down, that something was wrong, because it didn't start with that sign. The sign only confirmed a thing my gut had been telling me for months. It started the way everything true has come to me for 60 years, from reading a face. I told you a barber learns to read people. Well, I'd been reading my son for months, across those family dinners, and something in his face didn't sit right. There's a look a man gets when he's performing his concern instead of feeling it. I'd seen it 10,000 times in the mirror, the fellow who's telling you he's fine while his eyes are somewhere else entirely. And Kevin, when he'd lean in and call me Dad and ask so tenderly how I was managing, had that look. His mouth was doing love and his eyes were doing arithmetic. I didn't have proof. I didn't have anything you could point to. I just had 60 years of watching faces, and my son's face was lying to me, and a barber knows a lying face the way a farmer knows a coming storm. So I started, quiet, to pay attention. And the first person who put a hard fact under my soft feeling was my neighbor, Gus. It's a strange thing to start really looking at your own life after a long stretch of moving through it, half asleep with grief. It's like coming back to your own shop after being away and noticing all at once the little things that have shifted. A chair not where you left it, a bottle moved, somebody's been at your drawer. Little things, each one nothing by itself, that add up to somebody's been in here. I started noticing the little things. Bank statements that used to come to the house stopped coming. When I asked, Kevin said he'd switch them to online to make it simpler, and I nodded and I filed it away. Mail that seemed to have been gone through. Renee always finding a soft reason to steer me out of the little room where Marie used to do the books whenever I drifted toward it. A checkbook not where I kept it. Strange cars in my driveway on the afternoons they had suggested I go rest or go down to the shop. None of it was proof. All of it was a chair moved an inch. And 60 years of reading faces and rooms had taught me that when enough small things are wrong, you don't wait around for the one big obvious thing. Because by the time the trouble is standing in the middle of the floor in broad daylight, it's already too late to get ahead of it. You read the small signs early and you get ready early, or you don't get ready in time at all. So I started quiet to pay attention. And the first person who put a hard fact under my soft feeling was my neighbor, Gus. Gus Petrakis has lived across the street from Marie and me for 40 years. He's a widower too now, and retired. And he sits on his porch and watches the street the way old men do, and there is nothing that happens on our block that Gus doesn't see. And a few days after that young couple knocked on my door, Gus came shuffling across the street with his coffee and sat himself down on my porch step and said, "Sam, I gotta tell you something, and I don't want you to blow up. There's been people at your house. When you're out, when you're napping, cars pulling up, folks walking around your place, that agent, the one on the sign, letting people in your side gate to look in the windows. And a couple times, it was Kevin, showing them around, real friendly, and once I heard him tell a young couple, I wasn't eavesdropping, Sam, I was watering. I heard him tell him the old man was moving to a home, and the place would be empty by fall. I didn't know what to make of it. I figured maybe you knew. But it didn't sit right, so I'm telling you. There's been strangers walking your property, Sam, and your boy telling him you're leaving. Your boy telling them you're leaving. Gus put a hard fact under everything my gut had been whispering. And here's where I did the thing that decided the whole business. And I want you to understand the discipline it took, because everything in me wanted to do the opposite. I did not drive over to Kevin's and put my fist through his door. I did not call my son and scream. Because Gus had just told me my son was walking strangers through my home and telling them I was being carted off to a facility, and a younger, hotter man would have gone off like a firecracker. But 60 years behind a razor teaches you that the man who moves fast and hot is the man who cuts somebody. You don't fix a thing in a temper. You go slow and you go careful, and you get everything right before you make the one cut that counts. So I put my hand on Gus's arm and I said, "Gus, you're a good friend, and I need you to be a better one. Keep watching. Write down what you see, the cars, the dates, the agent, Kevin, all of it. And don't say a word to anybody but me. Can you do that?" And Gus looked at me a long moment, and something sharpened behind his old eyes, and he said, "Sam, are you telling me your own boy's trying to sell your house out from under you?" And I said, "I'm telling you, I mean to find out, quiet, and I mean to still have my house when I'm done. Will you help me?" And Gus Petrakis set his coffee down on my step and said, 40 years you've cut my hair and never once charged me right. You just tell me what you need." And for the first time since Marie died, I felt something in me that wasn't grief. It was purpose. I want you to understand who Gus is to me, because he's the thing my son got most wrong, and he's part of what beat him. Gus moved in across the street 40 years ago, and for 40 years, we've been the kind of friends that only old neighbors get to be, the kind where you don't have to talk to sit together. When his wife passed a few years before Marie, I was the one who sat on his porch with him the first bad nights. When Marie was dying, Gus mowed my lawn the whole summer without ever once mentioning it, so I'd have one less thing. He's watched my kids grow up from that porch, watched them bring home their own kids, watched the whole slow picture of my life play out across that street for 4 decades. And Kevin looked at Gus and saw an old man on a porch, part of the scenery beneath noticing. Walked his strangers right past Gus's house, never once thinking that the old fellow with the coffee was watching every car, clocking every stranger, and would remember it all. That's the arrogance that undoes men like my son every single time. They cannot see the people they've decided don't matter. Kevin planned the whole theft of my home in full view of a man who's known me 40 years and never once wondered what that man might be seeing. Gus saw everything. Gus wrote it all down. And for the first time since Marie died, I felt something in me that wasn't grief. It was purpose. Gus watching the street was one thing. Saving my house was another. And I knew a neighbor's notebook wasn't going to stop a sale. So the next morning, on a day I told Renee I was going to the barber shop to visit, I made a phone call I should have made the day Marie died. I called Miles Brenner. Miles had been our lawyer for the better part of 40 years. Not some high-rise operator, but a good, plain, careful neighborhood attorney about my own age, who'd drawn up our trust with Marie sitting right there beside me, who read every line twice and forgot nothing, and couldn't be hurried or charmed. I'd let Miles drift after Marie passed, let the space around me fill up with Kevin and Renee and their helpfulness. Calling him back felt like finding a good tool you thought you'd lost. I told him everything, in order, plain. The the paperwork handed to Kevin to help with, Gus's notebook, the strangers in my yard, and the sign, and the young couple on my porch, and my son telling buyers I was moving to a home. Miles was quiet a while when I finished. Then he said, "Sam, I'm going to talk to you as your lawyer and as a man who knew Marie. To put your house on the market, Kevin needed legal authority to act for you. And you never gave him that, did you?" And I said, "No, I never had." And Miles said, "Then he either forged a power of attorney with your name on it, or he's operating on nothing at all and lying to that agent. Either way, listen to me close, because this is the part that matters. A forged power of attorney is a felony. And more than the crime, it's what it tells us. A man who will forge your name to list your house will forge it on anything. But here's what worries me more than the sign, Sam. A quick sale isn't really the end game, and here's why. Even with a forged POA, a title company doing its job is going to catch problems at closing. So if the fast, quiet sale hits a snag, and it will, a man like Kevin doesn't give up. He escalates. And the way you escalate from, "I have permission to sell Dad's house," to, "I have the right to sell Dad's house," is guardianship. You go to a court, and you get your father declared incompetent to manage his own affairs, and you get yourself named his guardian, and then you can sell his house legally, right out from under him, and put him somewhere, and there's not a thing he can do, because on paper he's not a man who can do things anymore. That whole "poor dad," this house is too much for him, he's forgetting things, he's not safe alone, campaign your daughter-in-law's been running. That's not chit-chat, Sam. That's the foundation of a guardianship petition. They're building a case that you can't take care of yourself. So don't sign one single thing. Don't let them see you've woken up. And let me start pulling this apart. But first, everything hangs on one question. The house. Whose name is it in, and where's the deed? And standing at the payphone by the barbershop with the receiver against my ear, I felt the whole thing turn over in the dark, and I almost laughed, and it came out closer to a sob. "In my name," I said. "In the trust. Just mine, that only I control. And the deed and all of it are in a box at the bank that only I can open. Marie made me do it years ago. She said keep my name on the papers. She said a house is just wood and nails, but keep the name on the papers." There was a long silence on the line. Then I heard Miles Brenner let out a slow breath, and when he spoke, his voice had changed. "Sam," he said quietly, "your wife saved your home, and she's been gone 3 years. If that house is in a trust only you control, and the deed's where only you can reach it, then your son can plant 100 signs, and there is not one legal way on God's earth he can sell that house. Not with a forged POA, not with a fast-talking agent, not any way at all. Unless he can get a court to take you over, and that means the whole thing comes down to whether he can convince a judge you're incompetent. And that, Sam, we can beat, because you are the furthest thing from incompetent I've talked to all week, and we can prove it. But we have to find out everything he's already done, and we have to do it in total silence, because the second they know you're awake, they'll move faster than we can catch them." And standing at that payphone, an old barber with a receiver in his hand, I felt something come back up out of the cold that I'd thought had died with Marie. "All right, Miles," I said, "but I don't just want to stop the sale. I want the whole thing. The forgery, the money, the plan, all of it, laid out on a table where everybody can see it, where nobody can ever again call it a confused old man's imagination. And Miles, there's one more thing, and it's the most important of all. My daughter, Erin. They've kept her from me with lies for 3 years, and she works in title and escrow, and if there's a forged power of attorney out there, she'll know exactly how to find it and exactly what it means. I need my daughter back. Not for that. First, I just need my girl. But I can't reach her through the two who are robbing me." And Miles was quiet a moment, and then he said, "Sam Reardon, getting your daughter back in that room is the smartest thing you could do for your heart and for your case both. A daughter who loves you and who reads title documents for a living is worth 10 of me when they try to sell a judge on your decline. Let's bring your girl home. Let's save your house. Let's do it right." I called Erin that night from the back office of the barbershop after it closed on the shop's old phone that nobody would think to watch. It was the hardest call I'd made since the ones I made when Marie passed. She answered wary, that flat, careful voice we'd both worn for 3 years, the voice of two proud people who'd let a small thing calcify into a canyon. And I didn't give her the speech I'd been turning over. I just told her the truth. Plain, the way Marie always said, a hard thing ought to be told. Erin, I said, for 3 years I've been told you didn't want anything to do with me, that you blame me, that you'd washed your hands of your old man. And I believed it because I was grieving and because I'm a proud old fool who was still nursing a hurt from years back that was mostly mine to begin with. Well, I've found out it isn't true. Your brother and his wife told me one story and told you a different one, and they kept us apart on purpose, because they're doing something they can't do with you watching. They kept my own daughter away from me so they could rob me. You didn't abandon me, Erin. Somebody talked you out of the room, and I let them, and I'm sorry. For that, and for the stupid old business years back that I should have fixed the day it happened. I don't need anything from you tonight, girl. I just need you to know your daddy never once stopped wanting you home. There was a silence so long I thought the call had dropped. And then I heard my Erin, my proud, level, stubborn Erin who does not cry, start to cry, the deep kind, the kind of a person setting down a weight she's carried too long. They told me you didn't want me at the house, she said. They said you got upset when I came, that it was better for you if I kept my distance. I stopped trying because I thought I was hurting you. I thought I was staying away for your sake, Dad. And that broke the last of the ice. And my daughter and I cried together on the phone across 3 lost years. And it was the true beginning of the mending, and it was worth more to me than the house and every dollar under it. And then, because she is her mother's girl, she wiped her face and her voice changed, went sharp and level and professional, and she said, "Okay, now tell me exactly what's happening, all of it. And Dad, you said there's a sign in the yard. That means there's a listing. And if he listed it without your signature, there is a power of attorney somewhere with your name on it. And if you didn't sign it, then I am going to find it. And I am going to prove it's forged, because I do this every single day. And I have watched people try to steal houses this exact way, and it makes me sick. And I know precisely how the trick works and precisely how to take it apart. And I heard my daughter, 3 years lost, 1 phone call found, start to think like the professional she was, and I thought they should never, ever have let this one out of the room. When Erin finally did come home, quiet, in the thick of it all, she sat down at Marie's kitchen table, the same light. And she pulled the listing and the escrow file and the copy of that forged power of attorney toward her, and she went to work with a title professional's eye, and it was a thing to see. She'd tap a line and say, "There, that's wrong. The notary block doesn't match the acknowledgement date." She'd hold the forged POA up to the light and say, "Dad, I have seen your signature on 1,000 things over my whole life. This isn't it. Whoever did this didn't even get the R right. 3 years I'd been told this daughter wanted nothing to do with me, and here she was at midnight at her mother's table, taking apart the fraud against me one line at a time, because she loved me and because it was her trade. And somewhere past midnight she set it all down and looked around that kitchen, at her mother's grocery list still stuck to the refrigerator, at Marie's reading glasses she could see through the doorway on the bedside table. And she got quiet, and she said, 'You know what makes me the maddest, Dad? Not even the money or the house. It's that they used Mom being gone as the opening. They looked at you grieving, and they saw a window. And they used me being hurt and staying away, as part of the plan. They needed me out of the room because they knew I'd have seen it in a heartbeat. So they didn't just try to steal your house. They stole your daughter first, on purpose, so they could.' And she reached across that table and took my hand in both of hers, exactly the way her mother used to, and I just about came apart, because for a second it was Marie's hand and my girl's hand at once. 'Well, they don't get me anymore,' she said. 'I'm home. Now let's go get your house back.' And I heard my daughter, 3 years lost, 1 phone call found, think like the professional she was, and I thought again, they should never, ever have let this one out of the room. Erin couldn't come running that week without tipping them off, so we did it careful and quiet, calls after dark, a slow plan, her coming when the moment was right and not one day before. But she was in it now, all the way, and having her back in my corner made me feel, for the first time in 3 years, like a man with a family again instead of a mark. And over the next weeks, with Miles, we built the rest of the team. Miles brought in a forensic accountant named Yusuf Rahim, a patient, meticulous man who did this work for courts and could make a set of bank statements tell the truth they'd been hiding. He brought in an investigator too, a retired detective named Hollis Ward, who'd spent his last years on the job working real estate and elder fraud. A slow-moving, soft-spoken man who let silences do his work for him. Gus kept watching the street. Aaron, from the inside of the title world, started quietly pulling at the listing and the paperwork behind it. And I did the hardest job of all, which was to keep being the tired, agreeable old man who was maybe, sadly, just about ready to give up his house, to keep sleeping in my chair in the afternoons and nodding along at Renee's worried talk and letting Kevin steer me so that not one of them would suspect that the old man dozing in the sun had gone very wide awake indeed. The first time Hollis Ward sat with me, at my own kitchen table with the curtains drawn, I told him I wanted all of it, and I told him money was no object. He nodded slow, and then he said the thing these good ones always seem to say. "Mr. Reardon, before you spend $1, I'll tell you straight, because you look like a man who'd want it straight. When it's a stranger stealing an old person's house, it's just a case to me, and I close it and I sleep fine. When it's the man's own child, it's a different thing, and winning it doesn't stop it hurting. I've seen strong old men come apart at the end of one of these, right when they should be celebrating, because what we dug up was worse than not knowing. So, I have to ask you before we start, are you sure you want to see all of it, everything your son's done?" And I thought about that sign in Marie's roses, and the young couple on my porch, and Gus telling me my boy was walking strangers through my home. And I thought about Marie at the kitchen table, her finger tapping the wood, telling me to keep my name on the papers. And I thought about Katie, sweeping up hair at the shop, asking me to teach her to cut. And I said, "Mr. Ward, my son is trying to sell the house my wife died in, out from under me, while I sleep. I spent 60 years reading what's really going on in a man's face, whether he wants me to or not. No, I am not afraid of what's inside my own boy. Open it up, all of it." Hollis Ward nodded, and something behind those tired eyes sharpened, and he said, "Then give me a few weeks, and Mr. Reardon, keep being the old man who's about ready to give up and sign. It's the best thing you've got going for you." And I kept being that old man, all through those weeks, and I'll tell you, it was the hardest work I ever did, harder than any 12-hour Saturday I ever stood behind the chair. Do you know what it costs a man to sit at his own table and be talked over, and take it, with the truth locked in a folder in the next room? To hear Renee tell a cousin, in that sad, soft voice, how worried she was about Dad rattling around this big house all alone, and to nod along, vague and grateful, right on cue. To let my son slide a paper in front of me, to sign real quick, Dad, and to fumble it, and squint at it, and set it aside for later, when everything in me wanted to read it out loud and ask him to explain himself, to sleep in my chair on purpose, so they'd keep believing I slept through everything. I bit down on my own pride 100 times those weeks. There was one supper that was the worst of them, and getting through it was the hardest single thing I did in the whole business. Renee had some of her family over at my house, and she was performing the devoted daughter-in-law, and at one point, in front of everybody, she started cutting up my food for me, cut my meat into little pieces on my plate like I was a child, cooing about how she just wanted to take care of Dad. And everyone made warm noises about what a sweetheart she was, and I sat there, a man who'd held a straight razor to 10,000 throats with a hand that never once shook, and let my daughter-in-law cut my dinner into baby bites in front of a room full of people. And I said, "Thank you, Renee. That's kind." And under the table, my hands were fists, because I knew exactly what that performance was for. It wasn't kindness. It was evidence. She was building a picture in front of witnesses of a helpless old man who needed his food cut, a picture she could carry into a courtroom to prove I couldn't care for myself. Every "let me help you, Dad," every cut-up plate, every arm taken to walk me to a chair I didn't need help reaching was a brick in the case meant to bury me. And the discipline it took to let her lay those bricks, to help her build the very wall that was meant to wall me in, knowing all the while that every brick she laid in front of witnesses was one more brick I'd hand to Miles to prove they'd planned this cold, nearly broke me 100 times. But I let her cut my meat. I let her build her little picture, because I was building one too, and mine was true. And the day was coming when both pictures would be laid on the same table, and everyone would see which was real. I bit down on my own pride 100 times those weeks. But every time I wanted to break, to be the man I'd been for 60 years and run the both of them out of my house, I heard Marie, patient, go slow, keep your name on the papers. And I thought about the difference between a few weeks of swallowed pride and the whole rest of Katie's inheritance, and the home Marie died in. And I kept my face soft and my voice small, and my knowing down where they couldn't see it. Patience is the whole trade, in barbering and in this. You cannot rush the cut. You cannot rush the truth coming in. You wait, steady-handed, for the one right moment, and you don't move until it comes. It took Yusuf Rahim and Hollis Ward and Aaron the better part of 2 months to lay the whole thing out flat. And when they finally did, one evening at Miles Brenner's office with the blinds drawn, it covered his conference table. Let me give it to you the way they gave it to me. In layers, each one worse than the one before, because that's how a betrayal really shows itself. Not all at once, but a piece at a time, each piece cutting a little deeper than the last. The first layer was the money, and it was theft, dressed up in the language of helping dad. Now, thanks to Marie, the big things, the house, the trust, the protected accounts, Kevin had never been able to touch and never would, because they were in my name and locked where only I could reach. But the money he could get at through that helping, he had bled with method. Yusuf laid it out line by line. Using the access I'd trusted him with in my grief, Kevin had been quietly draining what he could reach, moving money out of the accounts he'd gotten onto, running up a line of credit against the house that I never knew existed, paying his own debts and Renee's spending out of his father's savings, dollar by dollar, month by month, hidden behind the paperwork he'd so kindly offered to take off my plate. He'd even, Yusuf showed me, been paying the real estate agent's early costs and some of his own mounting bills straight out of my accounts, using my own money to fund the theft of my own house. Laid out flat on Yusuf's spreadsheets, with the dates, it turned my stomach. And then Yusuf came to the dates, and his voice got careful, the way a decent man's voice goes careful when he's about to hand you something that will hurt no matter how gently he sets it down. Because the first movements, the first quiet transfers, the first test of how much he could take without anyone noticing, didn't begin after Marie died. They began before. They began the week of her diagnosis. That Tuesday. That very week, while I was learning to count my wife's good days on my fingers, my son had looked at his mother's death sentence and heard a starting gun and begun, small, careful one to take. While his mother was dying and his father was breaking, Kevin was moving money. There's a cold in a person that runs deeper than any hot hatred, and I had the proof of it in front of me in Yusuf Rahim's neat handwriting, dated, and it aged me 10 years and an hour, because here's the thing I finally understood, sitting with those dates. It's wasted on him. The words Renee wrote, the words that were underneath everything Kevin did, wasn't just a mean thing to say. It was a whole way of seeing the world, and once I heard it plain, I could see it running under all of it. To Kevin, a thing had worth only in the moment you could turn it into money and spend it. A paid-off house that an old man was just living in, not selling, not flipping, wasted. A trade you keep instead of cashing out, wasted. A life you hold on to instead of monetizing, wasted. And an old man himself, once he's done earning and started only costing, taking up a house somebody younger could be turning into money, wasted and worse than wasted, in the way. It's a way of looking at the world where nothing has value except what it fetches, and where a person who stopped fetching is just an obstacle. And the terrible clean logic of it is that once you see people that way, everything Kevin did makes a cold kind of sense. Of course you sell the house. It's wasted. Of course you file the old man away somewhere cheap and get on with turning his life into money. He's wasted, and he's the last thing standing between you and the check. I don't think my son ever felt like a villain, not for 1 minute. In his own head, he was just being efficient about assets that were being wasted. And one of those assets happened to be his father, asleep in a chair. That's not a monster. That's something colder and more common than a monster. That's a man who learned to price everything and value nothing. And there are more of them out there than any of us wants to know. I sat with that a long time, and nobody in the room said a word. They let me sit in it. And when I could talk again, I said, "All right, that's the money. But the money's not the plan, is it? The money was just what he could skim while he set up the real thing. The house. Show me the house. Show me how he thinks he's going to sell a house he doesn't own, and what he means to do with me." And Hollis Ward, quiet in the corner, leaned forward and opened a second folder and said, "This is where it gets bad, Mr. Reardon, because the money's just what kept him afloat while he built the real machine. And the real machine is a way to take the house and put you somewhere you can't stop him. And he's further along than you'd think." The second layer was the plan, and this is where it stopped being ordinary greed and became a machine, a patient, ugly, step-by-step design to take the house my wife died in and file me away across town. Hollis laid it out in order. Kevin was drowning, and the house was the life raft. A paid-off place on a lot the developers wanted badly, worth a fortune in a market gone hot. But the house wasn't his to sell, and the money he could skim was a trickle next to the flood he needed, and every dollar of the skim could be traced, as he was about to learn. What Kevin needed was the whole thing and fast, and there was only one honest way to get it, for me to sell willingly, and I wasn't selling. So he'd gone the dishonest way, and Hollis had documented every step. First, the forged power of attorney. There it was in the file, a copy Aaron had pulled through the title company. A power of attorney, purporting to give Kevin the authority to act for me in the sale of my house, with my signature at the bottom. A signature I never wrote. My son had forged his father's name on a legal document and had it notarized. And there was a question about that notary, a fellow named Delgado, who worked cheap and asked few questions, that Hollis was still pulling on. With that forged POA in hand, Kevin had gone to a real estate agent. A woman named Marla Sprague, the smiling face on the sign in my yard, and listed the house, telling her the sad, tidy story that his elderly father was moving into assisted living and had given his son power of attorney to handle the sale. And Marla Sprague, whether she believed it or chose not to look too hard at a quick commission on a hot property, had put my home on the market and started marching buyers through it while I napped. Second, when the sale ran into trouble, Ann Miles was right. It would, because a title company doing its job would eventually choke on a forged POA and a deed sitting in a trust. Kevin had a backup, and it was the guardianship. Through a lawyer, he'd been quietly laying the ground to petition a court to have me declared incompetent and himself name my guardian. And to do that, he needed proof of my decline, which is what the whole long performance had been for. Every worried word Renee dropped to a cousin about Dad forgetting things. Every remark about the house being too much for me. Every afternoon I could be described as sleeping all the time now, and not really himself since Mom. It was all evidence, seated and stored. For the day they stood before a judge and said, "Our father can't care for himself. Look, he's not safe alone. Here's a doctor who'll confirm it. Please put us in charge." And they had a doctor lined up, an acquaintance of the lawyer's, willing to write a soft, hedging note about cognitive decline in an elderly widower, based not on any real examination of me, but on what Kevin and Renee told him, a signature for hire dressed up as medicine. Third, once the house was sold, by forged authority or by guardianship, whichever cleared first, Kevin would pocket the money, cover his debts, and put me in a facility. And here's the part that Hollis said the coldest, and it's the part I carry. The facility they'd picked out, the place my son intended to warehouse me, would be paid for out of the proceeds of my own house. They were going to sell my home and use my own home's money to store me somewhere I couldn't interfere, and wrap the whole thing in the language of love. It's safer for Dad. The house was too much for him. We did what was best. We love him. The very same words used to make more old people disappear than any of us will ever know. 3 moves, my money to keep him afloat, my house for the big score, and me in a facility paid for with my own front door. I want to stop on that facility a moment, Brookhaven, the place they'd picked to store me, because Hollis had even driven out to look at it, being thorough, and it wasn't some snake pit. It was a clean, pleasant, expensive place with nice landscaping and a fountain out front, and that's exactly what made it so cold, because they weren't planning to be cruel to me. That's the part people get wrong about how this is really done. They weren't going to lock me in an attic. They were going to put me somewhere clean and pleasant with a fountain out front, and pay for it with the money from selling the house my wife died in, and tell everyone, tell themselves, that it was the loving thing, that Dad was safer there, that the house had just gotten to be too much for him. They'd visit it first for the look of it, and then, in Kevin's own written words, they wouldn't have to keep driving over to check on me, and I'd have sat in that pleasant place by that fountain, a sound man declared unsound, cut off from Gus and Katie and the shop and Marie's roses, watching out a window while strangers repainted my front room, and everyone would have said what a nice place it was, and what good children I had to arrange it. That's the cruelty of it. It doesn't come dressed as cruelty. It comes dressed as a fountain, and nice landscaping, and the word safe. It is the very same words used to make more old people disappear than any of us will ever know. 3 moves: my money to keep him afloat, my house for the big score, and me in a facility, paid for with my own front door. And here's the beautiful thing. The thing I turned over in that room like a comb through a familiar head of hair, feeling the shape of it. The whole plan was impossible. Every single piece of it depended on something that could not happen. The forged POA couldn't survive a title company doing its job because the deed was in a trust only I controlled and no forged paper could move it. The fast sale would choke, and the guardianship, the only thing that could actually give him the house legally, needed a court to declare me incompetent, and I was not incompetent. I was sharp as the day I opened the shop, and now I knew what was happening and could prove my own soundness with a real doctor and a daughter and 60 years of a whole town who knew me. My son had built a 3-move machine to take everything I had, and not one of the 3 moves could actually close. And the reason was that a woman 3 years in her grave had sat me down at a kitchen table and made me keep my name on the papers. He'd been throwing himself against a locked door, harder and more reckless every week, right up to forging my name and planting a sign in my yard, never once understanding that the door wasn't stuck. It was locked, and the old man asleep in the chair had the only key. I've thought about it since as a machine. Kevin had built himself a fine, elaborate machine. The isolation, the seated roomer, the helping with the money, the forged POA, the fast-talking agent, the tame doctor, the guardianship held in reserve, the whole long contraption, engineered to take everything I had. And he threw the switch and it roared to life, all that greed and cunning spinning at full speed. And it wasn't connected to anything. It had no grip. It was a great machine running flat out in empty air, because every single part of it needed to grab onto one thing: the deed, the title, the legal authority to move the house. And that one thing was locked in a box at the bank, with only my name on it and only my key to reach it. He could run that machine as hard and as long as he liked. It was never going to bite into anything, because a woman 3 years dead had made sure there was nothing for it to bite. He was a man sawing furiously at a chain that wasn't there, sweating, straining, getting nowhere, while the actual door stood quietly locked a few feet away, and the only key was in the pocket of the tired old man he'd written off as furniture. He'd been throwing himself against a locked door, harder and more reckless every week, right up to forging my name and planting a sign in my yard, never once understanding that the door wasn't stuck. It was locked. And the old man asleep in the chair had the only key. But Hollis wasn't finished, and the last thing he set on the table was the thing that took the air out of the room. Because along with the forged POA, there was a second document drawn up and waiting. A deed, a transfer of the house itself, ready for the same treatment, needing only a signature my son plainly meant to supply, the way he'd supplied it on the power of attorney, by writing it himself. The sign in the yard wasn't the end of Kevin's forging. It was the middle of it. And Hollis Ward, who'd spent his last working years on exactly this kind of case, named the crimes for me one at a time, in their plain right names: financial exploitation of a vulnerable elder, theft, forgery, fraud, attempted fraudulent conveyance of real property, and the attempt to strip a sound man of his freedom and his home through a false guardianship. And then he said, "Mr. Reardon, this stopped being about getting your money back a while ago. These are serious felonies, several of them. It's time we brought in somebody with a badge." There was one more thing Hollis found, and he brought it to me the way a decent man brings you the worst thing, quietly, apart from the rest, because some things have to land in private. It was my son's own words. There were messages, a thread between Kevin and Renee, and some between Kevin and the agent, Marla Sprague. Ann Hollis had come by them in the early going through means I didn't ask about, and the law later got its own proper hold of them the right way. I won't read you all of it, because a father has some pride left even at the bottom of a thing like this. I'll read you the parts I carried folded in my shirt pocket, over my heart, for weeks. My son wrote to his wife, "Relax, list it now, deal with the paperwork later. He naps every afternoon, that's the window. He won't even know it's on the market. Once we're in escrow, it's basically done. The POA covers us, and if title gets fussy, we go the guardianship route. Dad's half checked out anyway. Nobody's going to believe he can run his own life. Just keep the poor dad story going with your cousins. We'll need the witnesses. He naps every afternoon, that's the window. And Renee wrote back, I still feel bad doing it while he's asleep in his chair. But you're right, it's for the best. He can't keep that place up, and it's just sitting there worth a fortune. It's wasted on him at this point. It's wasted on him. And then the line that ended, in my head, whatever hope I had left about the man my son had turned into. Kevin wrote, exactly. Once the house sells and he's settled at Brookhaven, we're finally clear. And honestly, it'll be easier on everybody. We won't have to keep driving over there to check on him. He naps every afternoon, that's the window. Once he's at Brookhaven, we won't have to keep driving over to check on him, in their own words. About the man who taught Kevin to ride a bike in that driveway, who paid for the wedding, who cut his grandchildren's hair. I sat with that a long time in Miles Brenner's office, and I'll tell you honestly what I felt, because it wasn't what you'd expect. First, a terrible grief, for the boy Kevin used to be, before whatever got into him got in. And then the grief burned off clean, the way it has stayed burned off since. And what was left underneath was the cold, steady, quiet thing that 60 years behind a razor builds into a man's hands. And I folded that paper and put it over my heart, and I said, all right, Marie was right at that kitchen table all those years ago. Now, Hollis, there's one more thing I need, and it's the most important of all, my daughter. It's time to bring Erin home, all the way home, where those two can't see it coming. And Hollis Ward looked at me with those tired eyes, and one corner of his mouth moved, and he said, Mr. Reardon, bringing the good ones home is the only part of this work I've ever liked. And Erin came home, quiet, the week we set the trap, brought in without a whisper reaching Kevin or Renee. And the moment my daughter walked into that kitchen and I saw her face for the first time in 3 years, we both just stood there and then held on to each other and didn't say a word for a long while. Because some things don't want words. They want a daughter's arms around your neck after 3 years of somebody else's lies keeping them off you. There's one more thread I have to give you before the reckoning, and it's the one that troubled me most, because it had innocent people in it. Those buyers, that young couple who knocked on my door, and others like them Marla had marched through, they weren't in on anything. Hollis tracked down the couple who were actually in contract on my house, a nice young pair named Danny and Kate. First-time buyers, saving for years, so excited to finally have a home of their own. And they had no idea. They'd been told the sweet, sad, tidy story. A nice old man moving to assisted living, his son handling the sale, everything above board. They'd fallen in love with my house, Marie's roses and all, and they'd signed and put down their savings, and started imagining their babies in my children's rooms. And they had no notion on God's earth that the whole thing was a fraud and that the nice old man had never agreed to sell and was in fact wide awake and about to blow the whole thing sky high. When it all came out, those two kids were as sick over it as anybody. They'd been used as a battering ram against an old man without their knowing, and it turned my heart toward them. And I'll tell you before we're done how that came out, because it's one of the few sweet things in the whole business. And Katie, my Katie, sweeping up hair at the shop, ashamed of her father in that quiet, watchful way. Katie was the reason I did every bit of it, slow and careful, instead of just burning it all down. Because whatever I did to her father, I was determined it would never once touch that girl. There was an afternoon at the shop, in the thick of all this, when Katie was helping me close up, and she stopped sweeping and stood there with the broom and wouldn't look at me, and finally she said, Grandpa, is Dad trying to sell your house? I heard him and Mom. Are they going to make you leave? And I looked at that girl, and I had a choice, and I made it the way I hope I made most of the ones that counted. I didn't lie to her, but I didn't drop a 17-year-old into the middle of a war with her own father, either. I said, Katie, there are hard things the grown-ups have to sort out, and some of them are going to hurt, and I won't tell you they won't. But I need you to hear the most important part, and I want you looking at me when I say it. And she looked up, and she had her grandmother's eyes, and I said, whatever your dad's done, and we're going to leave that to the grown-ups. None of it is yours to carry. You don't inherit a man's wrongs, not the fault and not the shame. You are your own person, and what you are is a kind, sharp, good-hearted girl with the best pair of hands I've seen behind a chair since I was young, and that's worth more to me than this house and every dollar it'll ever fetch. Whatever happens in this family, you and I are solid. You'll always have me, and you'll always have a place at that shop, for as long as you want one. And that watchful girl, who'd been holding herself together alone in a house gone wrong, put her head down, and her shoulders shook, and I put my arm around my granddaughter in that shop that smelled of talcum and clippings, and I thanked Marie and God that at least one soul in the next generation had come up straight and true. Now, my Erin isn't a doctor, but she spends her whole working life around exactly this kind of paper, and she took one look at the soft, hedging little note Kevin's tame doctor had drafted about my cognitive decline, and she got that flat, dangerous calm she gets, the same one her mother used to get, and she said, "Dad, this is garbage. There's no real testing in here, no dates, no baseline. This is a man who wrote down what Kevin told him to write. You know what we're going to do? We're going to get you the real thing, and we're going to bury this." And she found the doctor herself, a straight-shooting geriatric specialist who couldn't be bought. And she drove me there and sat in the waiting room like the daughter she was. And I spent the better part of a day answering every question and doing every test they had. And at the end, that specialist put it in writing, plain and unshakable. Sam Reardon is fully competent, fully oriented, entirely capable of managing his own affairs. I built, in other words, the exact opposite of the file my son had spent 3 years assembling. He had a bought note and a seated roomer. I had a real specialist, a daughter who knew the paperwork cold and the truth. And Erin folded that evaluation and looked at me and said, "Let them try to take you over now. Let them just try." While I was quietly rebuilding my family and my case, my son was doing what greedy, impatient people always do when they're sure they've already won. He got careless, and he got cruel, and he got fast. His escrow was dragging. Title was asking questions, exactly like Miles said it would. And his debts were closing in, and the pressure made him sloppy, and sloppy was just what I needed. He stopped bothering to hide it. He talked about the sale on his phone right there in my kitchen. He talked about me in the third person while I sat 6 feet away. He brought Marla Sprague, the agent, right into my house one afternoon to measure for the listing photos. The two of them walking my rooms and figuring, and introduced her to me as a friend helping the family. And that smiling woman looked at Marie's front room with the flat appraising eyes of somebody seeing a staging opportunity, and shook my hand, and I smiled and shook hers, and thought about the deed sitting in a box at the bank with my name on it that this woman was never going to get her sign writer onto. They'd already sold it in their heads. They were just waiting on a snag to clear and an old man to sign. It never once occurred to them that the old man was the snag and that I was about to let them run right into it at a dead sprint. Because while they sprinted, I did the slow, patient, unglamorous work that actually wins these things. The work my son never had the discipline for. First, there was the quiet business of stopping the bleeding, and I did that with Miles and Erin, and it was one of the most satisfying stretches of the whole thing, precisely because it looked like nothing at all from the outside. Kevin had wormed onto accounts and opened that line of credit against the house, sure, but it was still my house, my name the only one that truly counted, and an owner who's wide awake, with his lawyer on call and his daughter reading every document, can do a great deal without anyone seeing his hands move. Quietly, we shut the doors Kevin had been carrying money out through. We froze what needed freezing, flagged the fraudulent credit line, and started the paperwork to formally revoke and denounce the forged power of attorney, all without a ripple Kevin could feel yet. And I'll admit, I took a private pleasure in imagining him checking his little pipeline and finding it running dry, baffled, never once guessing that the old man napping in the chair had reached out in the dark and closed the tap. And with Miles, I locked the whole thing down for good. A real ironclad arrangement, read to me line by line the way an honest man does it. The exact opposite of the papers Kevin slid across the table, telling me not to bother reading. I made a new will, with Miles reading every word aloud. I had my real competency evaluation in hand. And with Miles and Hollis and Erin, we took the whole machine. The drained money, the fraudulent credit line, the forged POA, the forged deed waiting in the wings, the guardianship scheme, the bought doctor, the agent, the pending sale to 2 innocent kids. And we brought it to the people whose job it is. Adult Protective Services opened a file. And a detective with the county's financial crimes unit, a sharp, unhurried man named Owen Corrigan, who'd seen far too much of exactly this, walked back through every date and document Yusuf and Hollis and Erin had assembled, and by the end, he had what he needed. He had the theft. He had a forged power of attorney, filed and provable, which turned out to be the loose thread that unraveled the whole coat. He had the fraudulent listing and the pending sale. He had the false medical note and my real one beside it. And he had, cleanest of all, my son's own written words about listing the house while I napped and warehousing me at Brookhaven, so nobody would have to check on me. And like nearly everyone who came into this story, Detective Corrigan developed a certain quiet interest in being in the room when it all got read out loud. Everything was ready. The estate, locked. My competence, certified. Aaron, home. Gus, watching. Miles, Yusuf, Hollis, Corrigan, and APS, ready. Katie, protected and kept clear of what was coming. The evidence, complete and verified. All that remained was to pick the moment. And my son, greedy and impatient, picked it for me. Because Kevin, desperate to get the stalled sale across the line, announced that he wanted to bring the buyers by for a final walkthrough and to have me there to just sign a few things so the sale could finally close and everything could be settled and easy. He wanted to do it here, at the house, with the buyers and the agent and a notary present. So it would look like a willing old man handing over his home with a smile. I knew exactly what those few things were, and I decided that my living room in the house Marie died in, with all of them gathered to watch me sign my home away, was exactly where I would settle this account. All I had to do was let them come, and a barber knows how to wait for the chair to fill. I set the bait, and I made it out of the one thing my son could never resist, my surrender. A few days before the walkthrough, I told Kevin I'd been doing a lot of thinking and that maybe he and Renee were right, that the house had gotten to be too much for me, that maybe it was time I let him handle things and move somewhere I'd be looked after. I said it in my smallest, most tired voice, an old man finally laying his burden down, and I watched my son's whole face open up with relief, and something uglier under the relief. I told him I wanted to do it right, all together, as a family, and that I'd want it done properly with everyone there, so nobody could ever say I'd been rushed or confused, and that pleased him. Witnesses to the willing old man, it slammed the last door on any trouble down the line, or so he figured. "That's the right call, Dad," he said, warm as I'd heard him since Marie died. "It really is. Mom would be proud of you for being so sensible about it. Mom would be proud of you." My son said that to me, greased to slide the last of it over. "We'll bring the folks buying the place by to say hello, get the papers signed, and you'll never have to worry about a single thing again." No, I don't expect I would have. The day came bright and clear. I'd gotten myself ready that morning, the way I used to get ready to open the shop on a big Saturday, back when my hands were young, and I knew I was equal to whatever walked through the door. I woke early, in the quiet, and I did what I do every morning now. I talked to Marie, but that morning I meant it differently. Not out of loneliness, but out of readiness. I told her it was the day. I told her I'd kept my name on the papers, the way she made me promise at the kitchen table, and that today she was going to win, through me, in the front room where she planted her whole married life. And I swear I felt her there, the way you feel a person in a house they filled for 51 years. Then I got up and put on my good clothes, the ones I wore to church and wore to bury her, and in my shirt pocket over my heart, I slipped a folded piece of paper, and I made myself a cup of coffee and sat in Marie's front room as the light came up through her window onto her roses, and I was not afraid. I felt the way you feel at the start of a day you have prepared for your whole life. The work was done. All that was left was to see it through with steady hands. I sat in Marie's front room a good while in that early light before anyone came, the way I've sat with my coffee to think through every hard thing of my life, and I thought about the shape of the day ahead. Not with fear. I'd run clean out of fear 3 years back, in a specialist's office on a Tuesday, but with the particular steadiness you feel at the start of a job you've prepared for right. It's the feeling I used to have unlocking the shop before a big day, when I knew whatever walked through that door, my hands were equal to it. Everything was in its place. Miles and his folder, Aaron, ready, Hollis and Detective Corrigan, ready. Yusuf's numbers, Gus's notebook, my real evaluation, the forged POA, their own words. The estate locked down tight. Katie warned just enough and kept clear of the worst of it. All of it prepared over long, patient weeks. And now, nothing left to do but let the day come and keep my hands steady through it. And I thought about how different this morning was from the mornings right after Marie died, when I couldn't get out of my chair, when I set 2 cups out and wept over the second one. That man could barely stand. This man had built, out of grief and patience, a thing that was about to hold against the worst his own son could bring. Same man, 3 years apart. That's what the patience buys you, if you can bear the weight. It turns the man who can't get up out of his chair into the man who's ready. I felt the way you feel at the start of a day you have prepared for your whole life. The work was done. All that was left was to see it through with steady hands. They came at mid-morning. Kevin was expansive and warm, playing the devoted son for an audience. Because it was an audience. Renee was there, and a cousin or two she'd brought along as support, so the record would show a loving family and a father giving his blessing. Marla Sprague came in her good blazer with a leather folder and that professional smile. There was a mobile notary, a tired-looking fellow with a stamp and a logbook, there to make it all official. And there, hanging back by the door, awkward and hopeful and holding hands, were Danny and Kate, the young couple, the buyers, come to meet the nice old man and see their future home one more time before it was theirs. They looked at me with such kindness, those two, so careful and gentle with the old man they thought was leaving, and it near about broke my heart because they had no idea they'd been made into a weapon. And Katie was there too, down at the edge of it, quiet and watchful, a girl who half knew, and I caught her eye and gave her the smallest steadying nod, and she swallowed and nodded back. I welcomed every one of them into Marie's house, and I let them believe all of it, right to the last minute, because a barber knows the cut is made at the very end, in one clean pass, not in 100 nervous little snips along the way. We made the small talk. Renee got everyone coffee in Marie's kitchen like it was already hers to pour from. Marla Sprague told the young couple what wonderful light the front room got, and how those rose bushes were such a charming feature. And I sat in my chair and agreed that yes, my wife had planted those roses, and watched a flicker of something cross Kate's young face, because she was a kind girl, and I think some part of her was starting to feel how strange it was, buying a home out from under the man still sitting in it. And then, right on cue, Kevin clapped his hands together and said, warm and easy, "Well, should we get the paperwork out of the way so these nice folks can get on with their day?" And Marla slid her leather folder in front of me and set a good pen beside it, and my son leaned in close, gentle as anything, and said, "Just a few signatures, Dad. It's all standard, nothing you need to read through. Marla's been over all of it. Just sign where the little tabs are, and it's done, and you're all taken care of. Nothing you need to read through. Just sign where the tabs are." There it was, the last snip. 3 years of a machine come down to this. My son's warm voice, a pen, a stack of paper he was telling me not to read, in my own front room, with witnesses he'd gathered, and 2 innocent kids standing by to make it all look like a happy ending. 60 years I ran a business, and never once in 60 years did I sign a paper I hadn't read to the last line, because Marie taught me and the trade taught me. And here was my own son, asking me to sign away the house his mother died in, on papers he was praying I wouldn't read. I looked at the folder, I looked at the pen, I looked at my son's warm, expectant face, and I picked up the pen. I saw Kevin's breath catch with hope, and I set it back down, gently beside the folder. And I said, in a voice that was suddenly not soft at all, "You know, Kevin, in 60 years I never signed a paper I didn't read first. I'm a little old to start today." And into the little silence that dropped over the room, there came the sound of a car in the drive, and then footsteps on Marie's porch, and then a knock at the door. Kevin's smile flickered. "Dad, are you expecting somebody?" "I am," I said. "Katie, honey, would you get the door for your grandfather?" And Katie, my Katie, who I'd told just enough and trusted with the rest, got up and walked to the door and opened it. And in walked Miles Brenner, my lawyer of 40 years, in his good gray suit, with a thick folder under his arm. And behind him came my daughter Erin, and the whole room went dead silent. And Miles looked around at my son and my daughter-in-law, and the smiling agent, and the tired notary, and the 2 frightened young buyers, and he said, "Pleasant as you please. Good morning, everyone. Sorry to interrupt. Mr. Reardon asked me to come by and read a few documents to the family before anybody signs anything. It shouldn't take long." And he pulled out a chair and sat down at Marie's table and opened his folder, and my son's happy ending ended right there, though it took him a moment to understand it. "What is this?" Kevin said. It wasn't really a question. The warmth had drained clean out of him, and the whole room had dropped into that held breath stillness, except this time it wasn't falling on me. This time, it was falling on him. Sit down, Kevin, I said, quiet, because I have never once in my life needed to raise my voice to be heard. We'll finish this, just not the way you planned. Sit and let Miles read a few things, and let me settle this account. It's the kind of thing I know how to do slow and clean. And I watched my son do the thing I'd watched him do his whole life. Hunt for the angle, the smile, the words that had always slipped him out of everything. And for the first time, he couldn't find one. There was a lawyer at his father's table, and a sister who was supposed to be estranged and 3 years gone, and something in the air that told even Kevin that a razor had come out and he was the one in the chair. He sat. And before Miles began, I looked around Marie's front room. Her roses out the window, the folder waiting for my name, the good pen, the buyers frozen and pale, the notary suddenly wishing he were anywhere else, Aaron beside Miles, Katie in the doorway. And I thought about Marie, who would have wanted to see this, and who in a way was seeing it, because every bit of what was about to happen she had made possible, years before, with her hand over mine on the kitchen table. And I thought, here we are, love, in your front room. Let's show them together what an old barber's been reading in the mirror all this time. Miles, I said, start with the house. Whose name is it in? And Miles Brenner opened his folder, and in a flat, clear, merciless voice, began to read. He read the trust, he read the deed. He read, in plain words that filled Marie's front room and could not be unheard, the thing my son had spent 3 years never thinking to check, that the house, this house, every board and nail of it, and the ground it stood on, was owned by Sam Reardon and by no one else, held in a trust that only I controlled and could not be sold, listed, transferred, or borrowed against by anyone but me. I watched it land on Kevin. I watched him understand at last that the house he'd already sold in his head, the life raft, the answer to every problem he had never been his to sell and never could be. That the door he'd been throwing himself against for 3 years, harder and more reckless every month, right up to forging my name and planting a sign in Marie's roses, had a name, and the name was his father, sitting quiet in the chair the whole time. And I watched the agent, Marla Sprague, go very pale and reach for her folder, because an agent knows the sound of a deal that was never real being read out loud. Now the money, I said. Miles? And Miles read out Yusuf Rahim's findings, cool and unhurried, and it was the theft laid bare. The accounts drained through the access I'd trusted him with, the secret line of credit run up against the house, the debts paid, and the spending covered out of his father's savings, all of it traced dollar by dollar back to Kevin. And then Miles read the dates, and when he said the date the draining began, the week of Marie's diagnosis, that Tuesday, I saw Erin's hand go to her mouth, and I saw her turn slowly and look at her brother with a horror that had no bottom to it, because she understood what it meant, that while she and I were losing her mother, Kevin was already counting the money. The young buyers, Danny and Kate, had gone white and still, beginning to understand what they had been walked into. The notary had quietly closed his logbook. Every figure Miles read landed in that silent room like a fact that could never again be unsaid. Kevin tried then. Of course he did. He'd talked his way out of everything his whole life, and even now, some animal part of him reached for the old smile. Okay, hold on. This is all a big misunderstanding, he said, spreading his hands. Reasonable, warm. Dad's been confused about his finances. I've been helping him. That's all this is. He asked me to handle things. He signed things over to me himself. Miles, with respect, you're getting Dad worked up over stuff he doesn't fully follow anymore. And I let him get that far because I wanted the whole room to watch him do it. Watch him try in the same breath to say I was too confused to know what I'd signed, and also that I'd knowingly signed everything over. And then I said, quietly, which is it, Kevin? Am I so confused you have to manage my whole life for me? Or am I sharp enough to have signed it all over of my own free will? Pick one, son. Because your whole plan needs me to be too far gone to know what I'm doing. And here I sit, knowing exactly what you did, down to the Tuesday you started. So, which father am I? The one too addled to run his own house, or the one who just caught you? And Kevin opened his mouth and shut it, because there was no answer that didn't hang him, and I watched him understand that the very story he'd built to take me, poor confused dad, was the story that proved I could never have knowingly signed anything over, and that the trap he'd built had his own name in it now. Now the rest, I said. Miles, show them how my son listed a house he doesn't own. And Miles laid it on the table, one document at a time, and named each one in that flat, clear voice. The forged power of attorney, my name signed at the bottom in a hand that was not mine. This is a forgery, Miles said, filed and used to list this house and to open a line of credit. Forging this signature is a felony, and it's already with the county's financial crimes unit. He set down beside it the notary's record and the questions around the fellow who'd stamped it. And then he set down the second document, the deed, the transfer of the house itself, drawn up and waiting, needing only a signature. Nobody at that table was ever going to get honestly. And this, Miles said, tapping it, is the same thing, drawn up and ready, needing only a forged signature to try to convey a house held in a trust that makes the whole attempt void on its face. The sign in the yard was never the end of it. It was the middle. And Marla Sprague, the agent, hearing a forged POA and a fraudulent listing read out loud with a detective's name attached, did what people like Marla do the second it gets real. She started backing away from her own client, fast. I was given a power of attorney that appeared valid, she said quickly, her professional smile gone. I had no way to know it was forged. I acted in good faith on the documents provided. If there's fraud here, it's entirely on Mr. Reardon's son, and I'll cooperate fully. Marla, Kevin said, low. But she was already gone over to the other side, already a witness, already saving her license, and Kevin sat there watching his own agent hand him to the law to save herself. He tried one more angle then. They always do, right up to the end. He turned to me and put the warmth back on and said, Dad, listen to me. You're being used. Aaron shows up out of nowhere after 3 years, and this lawyer, and suddenly they've got you all worked up and turned against your own son. Can't you see they're the ones manipulating you? Aaron wants the house for herself. That's what this is. And it was so brazen, so exactly backwards, that I almost admired it. And I said, quiet, Kevin, Aaron didn't show up out of nowhere. You two hid her from me for 3 years with lies, and I found her, and she came home. And she doesn't want this house. She's the only one of you who never once mentioned it. You want to know how I know she's not the one working me? Because she's the only person in 3 years who ever sat me down and read me every word of a paper before I signed it, instead of telling me not to bother. The ones who tell you not to read are the ones robbing you, son. The ones who make you read are the ones who love you. You taught me that yourself, this past year, without meaning to. And Kevin had no answer for that either, because there wasn't one. But she was already gone over to the other side, already a witness, already saving her license, and Kevin sat there watching his own agent hand him to the law to save herself. Then Miles set down the 2 doctors' notes side by side. The tame doctor's soft, examine-nothing note about my cognitive decline, the whole foundation of the guardianship they'd been holding in reserve, and beside it my real evaluation, the full workup from an honest specialist, certifying in plain language that Sam Reardon was completely sound of mind. Your backup plan, Miles said. The guardianship rests on that first note, written by a doctor who never examined your father. Here beside it is a real, documented evaluation that says the opposite. Care to guess which one a judge credits, especially after the medical board hears how the first one came to be written. And Aaron spoke then, for the first time, in the level professional voice of a woman who reads these documents every working day, and she said, I have handled hundreds of these files, and I am telling everyone in this room, there is nothing wrong with my father's mind, and there never was. You didn't need him to be declining. You just needed a judge to believe he was, so you could sell his house. I'll testify to that, and so will a specialist who actually examined him. And then I did the last thing, the one that was mine to do, because it was the deepest cut, and a father drives that one himself. I reached into my shirt pocket, over my heart, and took out the folded paper I'd carried there for weeks, and I opened it, and I laid it flat on Marie's table, and I read, in my plain, steady voice, to the whole room, the words my son had written. I read, list it now. He naps every afternoon, that's the window, he won't even know it's on the market. And I looked up at Renee, not at the paper, and I said her part to her face. I still feel bad doing it while he's asleep in his chair, but it's wasted on him at this point. And then Kevin's last line, quiet into the dead still room. Once the house sells and he's settled at Brookhaven, we're finally clear, and honestly, we won't have to keep driving over there to check on him." I set the paper down, and you could hear Marie's kitchen clock ticking on the wall. "You put a for sale sign in my yard while I was napping," I said, into the silence, looking right at my son. "You picked the afternoon because you were sure I'd sleep right through losing my own house. And you were right about one thing. You were dead sure everything I had was already yours. The house, the money, my whole life here. All of it, wasted on an old man too far gone to notice a sign in his own roses." I let it sit a moment. "But here's the one thing you forgot, son. In 3 years of forging my name and telling strangers I was leaving, you never once checked whose name was on the deed. You put a sign in my yard. You just forgot to look at whose name was on the title. It was mine, Kevin. It was mine the whole time you were walking strangers through your mother's front room. You can put a sign in a man's yard. You can't put your name on his deed." And then the thing happened that I'd counted on from the start. The thing that greed always does to people who only ever shared the greed and never anything else. Because the front door opened again, and in came Detective Owen Corrigan, quiet, in a plain jacket with his badge where everyone could see it, and a woman from Adult Protective Services behind him. And the moment the law was plainly in Marie's front room, my son's whole alliance came apart in about a minute, because there is no loyalty among people who were only ever in it for themselves. There's just the cold figuring of who goes down worse if they don't sell the others first, and faster. Marla Sprague was already a witness for the other side, already offering her files, already explaining to the detective how she'd been deceived. The notary was stammering about acting in good faith on documents presented to him. And Renee, my son's wife, the one who'd whispered so tenderly about how worried she was for me, took one look at that badge and those texts on Marie's table and turned on Kevin like a snapped strap. "This was all him," she said, fast to the detective, pointing at her own husband. "The forgery, the doctor, the whole thing, that was Kevin and his lawyer. I just went along with what he told me. I didn't know it was illegal." "Renee, shut your mouth," Kevin hissed, but she was already scrambling for the lifeboat, and my son sat there and watched the woman he'd ruined his soul for hand him to the law to save herself. And something in his face finally broke, the salesman's front gone for good. The whole rotten thing came down around Marie's table in under 2 minutes, everyone grabbing for whoever they could reach to keep their own head above water. I sat and watched it, quiet, the way you watch a bad haircut you warned a man about finally grow out into exactly the mess you told him it would be. And I want to tell you about the young couple, Danny and Kate, because in the middle of all that grabbing, they did a thing that gave me back a little faith. Kate was crying, and she came over to me, stepped right through the wreckage of it, and she crouched down by my chair, and she said, "Mr. Reardon, I am so sorry. We had no idea, I swear to you. We didn't know it was your house, that you didn't want." And I took that young woman's hand, and I said, "I know, honey, I could see it on you both the second you knocked weeks ago. None of this is yours. You just wanted a home. There's no shame on you here." And Danny, that young man, stood up straight and said to the detective, clear and steady, "Whatever you need from us, we'll tell you exactly what we were told and who told us." He said his father was moving to a home and was fine with the sale. That's what we were told, every step. 2 kids who'd been used as a weapon, and when it came down to it, they stood up on the side of the truth without being asked. I never forgot it. Kevin came to me last, when the grabbing had run itself out and there was nothing left to hold. He turned to me, and the anger drained out and something desperate rose up in its place. And he said, Dad, come on, this is family, we can work this out. You don't want to do this to your own son. Think about what this does to us, to Katie. Think about what it'll do to her." And there it was, my son reaching for that girl as a shield at the very last. And that was the thing that told me, more than the forgery, more than the texts, exactly how far he'd gone. And the whole room held its breath to see what the old man would do. I didn't shout. And I want you to understand this was the most important thing I did that whole day. My son wanted a scene. He wanted the old man's rage, something loud and ugly he could point to later, so he could tell himself and everyone else that this was just a family blowing up, a hard old father and a desperate son, and not what it actually was, a patient, careful theft dragged out into the light. I didn't give it to him. I gave him the truth instead, in the quietest voice I own. "You don't get to say that girl's name to me as a shield, Kevin," I said. "Not you. You were going to sell the house she grew up visiting. out from under her grandfather and put me in a home, and you told your wife it was wasted on me while I slept in my chair. So, don't you dare hold Katie up in front of you now. And here's the thing you never understood. In 60 years of watching your father do his trade, a man sits in my chair and lets me put a straight razor to his throat, and he closes his eyes because he trusts me. That's the whole job. That's the whole thing right there. A man trusting you with a blade at his throat, and you earning it every single time for 60 years. You had that from me. You had my trust the way every man in that chair gave me his. And you took my name and my money, and you tried to take the house your mother died in while I slept. You didn't just rob me, son. You put the razor to my throat and cut. And a man doesn't get that trust back, not ever. I can forgive you. And God help me, I will, because I'm too old and too tired to carry this to my grave. But I will never trust you again as long as I live, and you will never own one board of this house, because your mother saw what wanting had done to you, and she built a wall around this home you could not climb, from the grave. That's not me being cruel, that's just the bill, son. Come due. The way it always comes due. He had nothing to say to that. For the first time in his whole smooth, certain life, my son opened his mouth and found it empty. Detective Corrigan stepped in then, quiet, almost gentle, which somehow made it heavier and not lighter. There were things in the next hour I won't dress up for you. The forged power of attorney, the theft, the fraudulent listing, the guardianship scheme, the tame doctor's name going into the record, the lawyer's name going into the record, Kevin and Renee beginning to answer for what they'd built. I'll spare you the procedure. What I'll tell you is that somewhere in the middle of it, I got up out of my chair and I went to find Katie, because Katie was still in the house. Of course she was. She'd backed away from the table when the badge came in, and I found her on the back porch, 17 years old, white-faced, looking out at the yard where she used to run through Marie's sprinkler as a little girl. And I went out to her, these old knees and all, and I stood beside my granddaughter at the porch rail, and I put my arm around her and I said, "I've got you. Whatever happens in there, you hear me? None of this is yours, and you and I are solid as anything. Come on. Stand out here with your grandpa a minute and don't listen to any of it. It's always steadier out here by your grandma's roses. They were here before all this, and they'll be here after." And I stood with my granddaughter on the back porch while the law did its work inside, and I let it get done without me. Some things matter more than watching justice happen. A scared 17-year-old at a porch rail mattered more than watching my son answer for himself. I have never once been sorry I chose the porch. I didn't walk away from that morning to lick my wounds. In 60 years behind that chair, I never once left a job half-finished because it turned hard, and I wasn't about to start at 74 in my own front room, with the truth finally out in the open. And there was plenty of work left, because stopping my son was never really the point. That was just the moment the bleeding stopped. The healing came after, and the healing was the real work. The first thing to die was the sale. With the forged POA exposed and the deed sitting safe in a trust only I controlled, the whole fraudulent listing collapsed like a tent with the pole kicked out. There was never any legal way for that house to be sold, and now everyone could see it. Marla Sprague pulled the listing so fast the sign was out of Marie's roses by the end of the week. I watched her own assistant come and yank it out of the ground, and I stood at the window with a cup of coffee and enjoyed that particular sight more than a Christian probably should. And when he was gone, I went out and knelt down by Marie's roses where that sign had stood, and I worked the soil back smooth over the hole with my hands, and I told her it was all right now. The sign was gone, the house had held. The roses came back that June, the same as every June before it and every June since, right over the spot, like nothing had ever been driven into that ground at all. Marie always said those roses were tougher than they looked, that they'd outlast the both of us and anybody who tried to pave over them. She was right about that too, the same as she was right about everything, and most of all, about the one thing that saved us all. Keep your name on the papers, and keep the papers somewhere only you can reach them. The guardianship, the backup plan, never got within a mile of a courtroom, against my real evaluation and the ugly picture of how their scheme was built. No judge on earth was going to declare me anything but exactly what I am, which is a sound old man who reads every paper before he signs it. I stayed a free man in my own home, with my own name on my own deed, and it was affirmed in writing. The very thing my son had spent 3 years and a forged signature trying to take. The money came home, most of what could be traced. The big things, the house, the trust, the protected accounts, had never left my hands thanks to Marie, and never would. The money Kevin had drained, and that fraudulent line of credit he'd run up against the house. The law and the lawyers worked to claw back and unwind. And what could be recovered was recovered, and the false debt against my home was cleared off it, so that the house stood free and clear again. Mine, the way Marie and I paid it off with 51 years of haircuts. And I have to tell you how it came out for those two young people, Danny and Kate, because it's one of the few clean, sweet things in the whole business. Those kids had done nothing but want a home and get used as a weapon, and they'd nearly lost their savings in the wreck of a fraud they never knew they were part of. Their earnest money got sorted and returned once it all came clear. But that's not the sweet part. The sweet part is that I liked those two, and they, God help them, had gotten attached to me through the whole ordeal, and we stayed friends. When they finally did find their house, a real one, honestly sold about a mile from mine, this old barber went to their little housewarming, and I cut that young man's hair for his job interviews after, no charge. And when their first baby came, Kate brought her by so the old man could hold her. They wanted a home, and they got a home, and they got a cranky old grandpa by choice thrown in. And if you'd told me the day that sign went up in my yard that it would end with me holding those kids' baby in Marie's front room, I'd have said you were dreaming. But that's how it went. The house my son tried to steal became the place I hold my honorary great-grandbaby. There's a lesson in that somewhere about what a house is really for. The law took its time with my son, the way the law does. Slow, so slow I sometimes wondered if I'd live to see the end of it. But the wheels grind all the way down even when they grind slow, and they don't run backward. The case was as clean as they come, Detective Corrigan told me. Which is what happens when the victim kept his name on the papers, kept the real documents locked away, had a neighbor writing down every car in the driveway, and a daughter who reads title fraud for a living, and the guilty parties were fool enough to forge a signature and put their contempt in writing. There wasn't much of a fight in it. Kevin's own lawyer looked at the mountain, the forged POA, the traced money, the fraudulent credit line, the forged deed waiting in the wings, the bought medical note against a real one, the guardianship scheme, and their own words about listing the house while I napped and warehousing me at Brookhaven so they wouldn't have to visit, and did the only sensible thing. Kevin answered for the forgery and the theft and the fraud. Renee answered for her part, though she talked fast and traded hard to soften it. There was restitution, and there were consequences, and I won't walk you through every hearing because the procedure was never the point. I went to one of them and sat in the back on a hard bench in my good coat and watched a piece of my son's long, grasping end in a few flat sentences from a judge who'd plainly seen 100 Kevins and had no patience left for any of them. And I felt no triumph, none, only a tiredness as old as I am, because I was watching a whole life catch up all at once to my own boy, the one I taught to ride a bike in that very driveway. And no father, however wronged, is glad to see that land on the face of his child. Kevin's marriage didn't survive it, which surprised nobody. Inside a year, Renee was gone, and Kevin was alone with what he'd done, in a quiet he'd made himself. And I know something about a house gone quiet, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone, not even him. He came to me, eventually, stiff, unable to meet my eyes, and asked in so many words whether I could ever forgive him. And I'll tell you what I told him, because it's the truth, and because I don't want you thinking this ends with a hard old man turned to stone. I told him yes, I forgave him. I laid the whole weight of it down, for my own sake as much as his, because I am old, and I have already buried the one person I'd carry that kind of weight for, and I will not spend the years I've got left dragging a stone around for my son. But forgiveness and trust are not the same thing, and I told him that too, plain. I forgave him, freely. I will never trust him again, not with $1, not with a signature, not with a key to anything I love. That door is shut, and he shut it himself. The afternoon he put a sign in my yard while I slept. He has my forgiveness, if he wants it. He does not have my trust, and he never will, because he spent that clean to the bottom, and trust is the one account that can't be clawed back by any court. But there was a piece of my son's wreckage I was not finished with. Not by a long way. There was Katie, and there was the daughter who'd never wanted a nickel of any of it, and who deserved everything precisely because she'd never wanted it. There was Aaron. When it was all over, and I sat down with Miles to decide how everything should be arranged, The house, the money, the shop, the name. I did it with him reading me every line out loud, which is exactly how a thing like that ought to be done, and the exact opposite of how my son tried to make me do it, with a pen and a stack of paper and, "You don't need to read it, Dad." And the decisions weren't hard, because for the first time in 3 years, I knew exactly who was who. Kevin would never own one board of this house, nor see a dollar of what he'd tried to take, and Miles wrote it airtight, no gap for anyone ever to work a finger into. But I didn't punish Katie for her father's sins, and I didn't punish Aaron, who had never wanted any of it and had proven, precisely by not wanting it, that she was the one who ought to have a say. I provided for Aaron, my stubborn, level daughter, and the most important thing I gave her back wasn't in the will at all. It was the 3 years and the truth about who'd stolen them and whatever time she and I have left. Aaron and I talk near every day now. She comes by with her family. The 3 years those two stole from us are the one thing in this whole story no court can give back, and I grieve them. And I've stopped letting them make me bitter, because grieving what's gone and holding tight to what's left is the only way I know to grow old without turning to leather. And then there was the house, and the shop, and the Reardon name. Katie came to live with me, slowly, naturally, the way these things happen. A few nights when her house got to be too much. Then most nights, then it was simply home, with what blessing Renee could manage from where she'd ended up. And Katie came to the trade in earnest, not the way she had as a little girl sweeping up. She came as an apprentice, and I taught her the way old Nunzio taught me 60 years ago, how to hold the scissors, how to talk to a nervous man and a crying child, how to work a straight razor slow and sure so a man can close his eyes and trust you, how to listen more than you talk, which is 9/10 of the whole trade. I'll tell you about the day I taught Katie her first straight razor shave, because it's one of the best days I've had since Marie passed. I had her practice for weeks first, on a balloon covered in shaving cream, the way old Nunzio had me do it 60 years ago, because if you can shave a balloon without popping it, you've got the touch. And when she was ready, her first real face was mine. I sat down in my own first chair, and I tipped my head back, and I closed my eyes, and I let my 17-year-old granddaughter put a straight razor to her grandfather's throat, and her hands were shaking, and I said, "Easy now, feel the grain, don't fight it. Short strokes, no pressure, the blade does the work, you just guide it. And Katie, I'm not scared. You know why? 'Cause I've watched you, and you've got it. Now go slow." And that girl gave her grandfather the closest, cleanest, most careful shave of his life. Slow and sure. And when she wiped the last of the cream off my jaw, and I opened my eyes and looked at her in the mirror, she was crying, and I said, "What's the matter, honey?" And she said, "You trusted me with a razor at your throat, Grandpa." And I said, "That's the whole job, sweetheart. That's the whole thing right there. Somebody trusting you with a blade at their throat and you earning it. You just earned it. You're a barber now." Her own father had that same trust from me once, the trust of a razor at the throat, and he cut me with it. This girl took it up like the sacred thing it is. That's the difference between them, and it's the difference that decided who'd have the shop. Katie has the hands. She has the patience. She has the thing you cannot teach, which is that she truly likes people, likes hearing them, the way a real barber has to. She's licensed now, my Katie, cutting hair in the first chair at Reardon's. And the old regulars come in just to be worked on by Sam Reardon's granddaughter, and some of them tear up in the mirror and don't say why. But I know why. It's because a thing they thought was ending didn't end. It's because the shop's still there, and a Reardon's still in it. I had Miles write it into the papers, plain. The house, Marie's house, with her roses, and the shop, and the name, would go to Katie, held safe until she's grown, but hers. Not to someone who'd sell it off for the lot, value the first time money got tight, but to a girl who'd keep the roses watered, and the shop's lights on, and the name over the door. Because Katie, when she was old enough to think about the life she wanted, told me she wanted this one. The shop, the chair, the neighborhood, the slow good work of knowing people across their whole lives. And I am not going to try to tell you what that did to an old man. There aren't words for it, only the feeling you get watching a girl you love sweep up her own shop at the end of the day in the same light your wife stood in 50 years ago. They wanted to sell Marie's house for the lot and warehouse me on the proceeds. Instead, the roses are blooming, the shop's still on the corner, and there's a Reardon in the first chair with her grandmother's eyes and her own good heart. That's the final tally. On the things that actually count, my son took nothing at all. That left the question of the money that came home, and what to do with it. And here I have to tell you about Marie one more time, because what I did for her, and in her name. I didn't need it. I'm 74, the house is mine and clear, the shop is Katie's future, my wants are few. A good cup of coffee, a chair to work, a few heads a week, my daughter's voice on the phone, my granddaughter's laugh in the next room. So, the money that came back, I didn't put in the bank to sit there. It had been stolen with a particular kind of cruelty. The cruelty of going after an old person exactly when he's most alone and most broken, and using the words safe and family and love as the crowbar. And it seemed to me that money ought to go back to fighting that exact cruelty. So, with Miles I set up a foundation, and I named it for my wife, the Mari Reardon Fund. The fund does one thing, and it does it with all the stubbornness Mari used to put into those kitchen table books. It helps old people who are about to lose their homes to the very family that's supposed to protect them. Because I learned, going through this, just how common my story is, and how quiet. All over this country there are old people sitting in paid-off houses that have quietly become worth a fortune, and there is almost always somebody circling, a son, a nephew, a helpful someone, with a forged paper and a soft voice and a plan. And I've learned through the fund and through the letters folks send me after, just how common it is and how quiet. For every story like mine that comes out into the light, there are a dozen that never do. A dozen old people, alone in a house at the end of a life, being emptied out a little at a time by somebody who smiles and says, family, who never get a Gus with a notebook, or an Aaron who reads title fraud for a living, or a Marie who made them keep their name on the papers. They just get taken, called confused when they object, move somewhere quiet, forgotten, and it happens in fine houses and plain ones, to sharp people and gentle people alike, because it doesn't prey on weakness of mind. It preys on loneliness and trust and love, which are not weaknesses at all, but the best things we've got. That's what makes it so cruel. It turns the finest things in a person into the tools you use against them. And most of the ones it happens to never even find out for certain, or find out too late, or find out and are too ashamed to say a word. So, when that one thread, a forged signature of all small things, pulled loose a scheme that would have gone on to somebody else's mother or father, I counted that as one of the truest wins in the whole business. My house I saved for me and for Katie, but shutting that kind of thing down counts for people I'll never meet. And that felt like Marie's work more than mine. All over this country, there are old people sitting in paid-off houses that have quietly become worth a fortune, and there is almost always somebody circling, a son, a nephew, a helpful someone, with a forged paper and a soft voice and a plan. The fund pays for lawyers like Miles and forensic folks like Yusuf, and investigators like Hollis for old people who can't afford them. It fights forged deeds and forged powers of attorney and guardianship petitions filed in bad faith. It helps sound old people prove they're sound, which is the most humiliating thing you can ask of a person, to prove your own mind is your own. And it teaches Marie's rule, plain and hard, the rule of the finger tapping the kitchen table, to anyone who'll listen. Keep your name on the papers. Keep your home in your own name in a trust you control. Be as generous with your children as your heart tells you, but never sign over your home while you're alive and in your right mind, and read every single paper before you sign it, no matter how sweetly somebody tells you not to bother. A house is just wood and nails, but keep your name on the papers, because your name on the papers is the wall that keeps the home safe for the people who deserve it. And I'll tell you the thing I came to understand about why so many of us old ones get taken, because it might do somebody some good to hear it from a man who nearly lost the house his wife died in. It isn't that we're stupid. It's that we're lonely and grieving and tired, and one day somebody shows up with a warm smile and the word family. And after months of a silent house, that warmth is so good, you hold your hands out to it without ever checking where the fire's really coming from. And worse than the loneliness is the shame, because the moment you first suspect that the child who says they love you is robbing you, the very first thing you feel isn't anger, it's shame at thinking such a thing about your own boy. And the shame seals your mouth. You tell yourself, I must be wrong, I'm just a bitter old man now, I can't think that about my own son. And while you sit there ashamed of your own good instincts, they work. So, the Marie Reardon Fund exists to tell those old people one thing before it's too late. Don't be ashamed to look. Looking is not a betrayal of the people you love. Real love holds up fine under a clear eye. Only a swindle needs you to keep your eyes shut. Let me tell you about one woman, because one person says what 1,000 numbers never can. Her name was Pearl. That's not her real name. And she was 80 years old, a widow, and her grandson, who she'd raised, forged a quit-claim deed and signed her house over to himself and had it recorded, and by the time she understood what had happened, there were strangers telling her she had 30 days to get out of the home she'd lived in for 50 years. Pearl came to the fund shaking, half convinced it was somehow her own fault, that she'd signed something and forgotten because that's what they'd told her, that she was confused, that she'd agreed, that she just didn't remember, and that, believe me, is the cruelest part of the whole business, convincing an old person she's lost her wits so you can take everything she has, including the truth about herself. The fund put a real lawyer beside her and forensic help, and they proved the deed was forged and got it undone and got Pearl back into her own home free and clear. But that's not the part I keep. The part I keep is Pearl's face on the day it was over, when a judge told her, in plain words, that the house was hers, that it had always been hers, that she hadn't imagined a thing. I have never seen relief like it. She looked like a woman handed back not just her house, but herself. And I stood in the back of that courtroom and thought of Marie, and I thought, there. That's what the money was for. It was never mine. It was hers. And that's what she does with it now, from wherever she is. Still keeping the books, still keeping our name on the papers, still looking after the ones nobody else will. And in the end, I went back to the shop. That's the simplest part, and the best. I don't stand behind the chair the way I did at 40, 10 hours on my feet. At my age, you learn what to hand off, and I've handed the hard days to Katie. But I go in, I work a few heads a week, the old regulars mostly, men I've been cutting for 40 and 50 years, and we don't talk much, and we don't need to. I went back to being a barber instead of a man being managed toward a facility. And I'll tell you, there's no finer feeling I know than the weight of the scissors in my hand and an old friend in the chair and the little bell over the door and Katie working the chair beside mine. And I do a thing now that I'm prouder of than almost anything in my life. Once a week, I take my kit to the places where the old and the alone are kept, the assisted living homes, the very kind of place my son meant to warehouse me in. And I cut hair for free. For people nobody comes to see, because I learned something, going through what I went through, about what it is to be treated like a thing that's just in the way. And there is nothing, that gives a forgotten old man back his dignity like somebody taking the time to make him look like himself again, to put a warm towel on his face and a careful blade to his jaw and treat him for 20 minutes like he still matters, because he does. I've watched men who hadn't spoken in a week start telling me stories the second the clippers came out, because a barbershop, even a folding chair in a nursing home common room, is a place a man gets to be known again. Marie would have loved that I do this. It's the most barber thing and the most Marie thing I've ever done, both at once. There was one old fellow at one of those homes, sharp as a tack and mean as a snake because the world had forgotten him, who dared me the first day to make him look human, certain I'd fail like everyone else had failed him. And I didn't say much. I just put the towel on his face and took my time and gave him the best shave and cut of his life, slow and careful, the way you do it right. And when I turned him to the mirror, the meanness had gone out of his face and something else had come up, and he looked at himself a long time, and then he looked at me and couldn't quite talk. And a nurse asked me later why I bothered at my age, after everything my own son had done to me, why I'd spend my time on forgotten old strangers. And I told her the truest thing I know. I said, a haircut isn't about the hair. It never was. It's one person saying to another, you're worth the time it takes to do this right. You're still here. You still matter. My own son looked at me and saw a thing that was just in the way. Every forgotten old man I turn back toward a mirror, looking like himself, is my answer to that. It's me saying, no, not wasted, not in the way. Still here and still worth the careful work. That's the thing, the people who only count what a thing is worth never understand. That the worth of a person isn't a number, and it doesn't go down because they've stopped earning. It goes right on to the end, and it's our whole job to keep telling each other so. Let me tell you about one Sunday this past year, because it's the answer to that other morning, the one with the folder and the pen and the papers I wasn't supposed to read. It was a supper, at my house, Marie's house. in the front room where all of it nearly came apart. But the room was different. Erin was there, in with her family, laughing with her head thrown back exactly the way her mother used to. Katie was there, licensed now, showing her aunt a new fade she'd learned and getting teased for it. Danny and Kate came by with the baby, because they're family now, in the way you choose. Gus Petrakis walked over from across the street the way he does. There was food and noise and the good kind of argument, and Marie's roses were blooming right outside the window. And halfway through it I had to get up and go stand at that window a minute, looking out at the roses, because some kinds of happiness are too big to sit still with at a table. There was an empty chair. I didn't set it on purpose. It's just that when you lay a table for family, your hands count the old number, and there was one seat too many, and that seat was Kevin's, and he wasn't there, and won't be. And I'll tell you something honest about that empty chair, because I've looked at it a good while. I don't feel hatred when I look at it. Hatred is heavy, and I'm old, and I've already buried the one person I'd carry that kind of weight for. But there's no place set for him either, because here's what I finally learned, all the way down, the thing it took my own son planting a sign in my yard to teach me. Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. They sit side by side, so people mix them up, but they run on different ground. I can forgive a man, lay the weight down, even hope, somewhere far underneath, that he finds his way to being better than he was. And in the very same breath, never trust him again. Never hand him a key, never seat him at the table. Forgiveness is a thing you do to set yourself free. Trust is a thing a person earns and spends, and once it's spent the way Kevin spent his, a son forging his father's name and selling his mother's house while the old man slept, it doesn't come back at any price. And there's a thing about that empty chair I want to say for Katie, because someday she may see this story told, and she deserves the truth, said with care. Kevin is her father, and always will be, and I have never once said a word to that girl to turn her against him. I did the exact opposite of what was done to Erin and me. I did not poison the child's ear against her own blood. I told Katie only the plain truth of what happened, when she was old enough to bear it, and then I left her free to love her father as much as her own heart needs to, without shame, without me sitting in judgment of it. Because a child has the right to love a parent even when that parent hasn't earned it, and to take that from her would be to do to Katie the very thing that was done to my daughter and me. The empty chair isn't a rebuke aimed at that girl. It's just the plain fact of a thing that broke. And in this family, from here on, we don't hide the broken things, and we don't lie about them either. We look at them square, in good light, and then we get on with loving the people still at the table. If Kevin ever becomes a man, you can hand a key to again, Katie. You'll have my blessing to hand him one. But not to this house, and not with papers in his hand. That lesson I paid too much for to ever forget. And I think about fathers and children, sitting there looking at that empty chair. For years I ached because Erin and I had gone cold, and I warmed myself instead at the son who seemed so ready to come close. And I had it exactly backwards. The child I'd let drift away loved me enough to come home and take apart the machine that was eating me alive. The one who came close to get his hands on the house. It is not the child who wants your inheritance who loves you. It's the one who'd treat it the way you treated it. The one who'd water the roses. I learned that almost too late, and I carry the almost like a nick you give yourself with a razor, a little sting to remember by. But almost too late still means in time, and in time is all a man can ask for. So let me tell you what this whole thing taught me, from the seat of an old barber who thought he'd learned everything a man needs to know, standing behind a chair for 60 years, and found himself, at 74, back at school with grief and betrayal for teachers. I learned that the loudest man in the room is almost never the one holding the deed. My son was smooth and certain and warm when it served him, and he filled every room with his sureness that he'd already won, and he had nothing. I was quiet and slow and half asleep in a chair, and seemed to have nothing, and I held everything, because a woman 3 years in her grave had made me keep my name on the papers. Don't let the noise fool you. Look at whose name is on the paper. Always look at whose name is on the paper. And I learned one more thing, maybe the strangest of all, and I'll give it to you because it might be the most useful. I learned that being underestimated is a kind of power if you've got the patience to use it instead of the pride to waste it. My whole life, being underestimated made me angry. The folks who figured a barber was a simple man, the ones who talked down to me, the son who decided his old man was finished and asleep. And in this, for the first time, I stopped fighting it and started using it. I let Kevin think I was beaten. I let Renee cut my meat. I slept in my chair on purpose. I wore the very smallness they'd decided I had, like an old coat, and underneath it I did all my real work where they'd never think to look, because they'd already decided there was nothing there to see. A man they've written off can move freely, because nobody watches a ghost. Every single day they underestimated me was a day I got more done. So, if you're old, and you can feel the world starting to write you off, I know how it burns, I do. But there's a gift hidden in it, if you're patient enough to dig it out. Let them think what they think. Do your quiet work underneath, and be there, wide awake and clear-eyed, on the day they finally look up and realize the old man they wrote off has been holding the only key the whole time. Don't let the noise fool you. Look at whose name is on the paper. Always look at whose name is on the paper. I learned that patience isn't weakness, even though it wears the same coat. And that's exactly why impatient people mistake it for weakness and throw themselves against it and break their teeth. I spent weeks playing the tired old man about to sign, swallowing my pride at every supper, letting them think I slept through everything, feeding a folder in the next room. Not because I was weak, because patience is the sharpest tool there is. You cannot rush the cut. You wait, steady-handed, for the one clean pass, and you don't move until the moment is right, and then you move once, and it's done. They thought I did nothing because I couldn't. I did nothing because it wasn't time yet. I learned that a man reaps what he sows, and that it's not a saying, it's a law, as sure as hair growing back. My son sowed 3 years of lies and theft and contempt, in the dark, sure nothing would ever come up. It came up. It always comes up. You can plant a thing in secret, but you cannot keep it from growing, and you don't get to choose the day it comes ripe. And one morning, you're standing in the crop you sowed, whether you meant to plant it or not. I didn't do a thing to Kevin. I just stopped protecting him from his own harvest, and kept my name on the papers and waited. And I learned the difference between what a thing is worth and what a thing is. My son looked at the house his mother died in and saw a lot value. He looked at 51 years of our life and saw square footage. He looked at me, asleep in my chair, and saw a problem to be handled while I dozed. He spent his whole life counting what things are worth, and he ended with nothing. Because a man who only counts what things are worth never owns anything that's actually worth anything. The things that count don't have a price. They have a name on a deed, and a girl with the right hands in the first chair, and roses that come back every June, whether anybody deserves them or not. You can put a sign in a man's yard. You can't put your name on his deed. You put a sign in my roses while I slept, son, and you never once checked whose name was on the title. And it was mine, the whole time you were showing strangers your mother's front room. Keep your name on the papers. That's the whole of it. That's what a woman told a tired old barber at a kitchen table, with her finger on the wood. And it's the truest thing I ever learned in 74 years of learning things the hard way. The house held. The way a house holds when it's built honest and kept in the right name through the hardest weather a family can throw at it. Marie, you were right about all of it. About him, about them, about the children, about that one small, stubborn thing you made me promise at the kitchen table, with your hand over mine. I kept my name on the papers, my love. I kept it to the end, and it held everything. The house, and your roses, and the shop, and the girl in the first chair, and the room I get to hold that young couple's baby in. You always could find the one line in the ledger that came out in our favor, no matter how bad the year, and you found it one last time, 3 years gone, and the line read, his name is still on the papers, and because of that, so is everything else. If you've come this far with me, and if there's an old person in your life, or if the old person is you, take the one thing that matters out of all of this. The kindness that can't be refused, the help that always seems to come holding a paper to sign. The child who decides a thing is wasted on you. Look at it hard. Most of the time it's just love, thank God. And if that's what you find, get down on your knees and be grateful, because that's the richest thing there is. But sometimes, it's a sign going up in your yard while you sleep, and the only way to tell the difference is to keep your eyes open, and your name on the papers, and your own hand on every document before you sign it. Trust the people who beg you to read. Be careful of the ones who tell you not to trouble yourself. It's the simplest thing I know, and it saved the house my wife died in, and I learned it from a woman who kept the books at a kitchen table and loved a stubborn old barber for 51 years. Thank you for staying to the end. If any of this rang true for you, If you've ever woken up to find somebody had decided your life was theirs to hand off, or if you're watching it start to happen to somebody you love, then do the small, unglamorous things that actually hold. Find out today whose name is on your deed and your accounts. While it's easy and nobody's rushing you, read every line before you sign it, no matter how sweetly somebody tells you it's nothing you need to trouble with. Keep the real papers where only you can reach them. And if your gut tells you something's off, don't be ashamed to look. Write it down, the way Gus wrote it down, and call somebody who loves you and isn't the one you're worried about. Those are the fences, and they hold. Go check your papers. And if you can, go sit an hour with somebody old and alone, not with anything to sign, just to sit, and let them tell you about their house or their life or the person they lost. Because loneliness is the door that people like my son come through. And sometimes the only lock you need is somebody who shows up for the right reason. And if you're the old one, the one being managed and moved along and told your life is wasted on you, hear this from a man who woke up from his nap and found a sign in his yard and came through it with his home and his family and his name. You are not finished. Not while your name's on the papers, not while there's a chair to work and a face in the mirror to make right. And if you hold somebody tonight, let it be one of the ones who'd water your roses, not one who'd plant a sign in them while you slept. My son put a for sale sign in my yard while I was napping and marched a buyer up to my door. In the end, the old man's name was on the title, and on the house, and on all of it. And the girl who will have it after me isn't the one who wanted to sell it. It's the one who wanted to keep the lights on and the roses watered and the name over the door. That's the only inheritance worth leaving, and it's the one thing my son could never take and never understood and never will. He set his sign in my roses while I dozed in the sun and knocked a young couple up my walk to see what wasn't sold. I woke and read his face the way I've read 10,000, done the same slow trade for 60 years. I know a lie when it's told. He forged my name to list the walls my Marie died inside, and never thought to check the deed, so certain I was through. He counted what it all would fetch. He never once had tried to learn the thing his mother knew. What's worth is not what's due. Marie, at the table, your finger on the line. A house is only wood and nails. Keep your name on the deed. I made it home. I won't always be here, so the name stays mine and yours, and safe for whoever's left that still deserves the need. The roses hold. The little bell still rings above the door. There's a Reardon in the first chair with your eyes and steady hand. The sign is gone, the deed's still mine, the house is home once more. And the boy who'd sell it learned too late whose name was on the land. He's no fool who works a trade for 60 years, nor he who waits. The owner's the one whose name is down, with patience and with proof. Time keeps the ledger square in the end and settles the estates. To me, it left the home. To him, the harvest of his own truth.